Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is having a grand day. It's about afternoon here, so it's probably afternoon everywhere else. I do believe it's like afternoon here last. Maybe I'm wrong. I am horrible about that stuff. I went live just as the dog decided he needed to go outside. So we're going to travel outside for a second as I'm sharing this out. I am also over on YouTube, but over on YouTube, I'm not there right now. I don't hear me. Back up. Switch no. My cat really wants to go outside. He will be leaving tomorrow, which is kind of sad for me. All of my cats have found lovely new homes, but it's been a little hard for me, so I'm dealing with that one too. I thought today we would go ahead and do a little bit more of a focus on science and medicine being Indigenous. It's been a while since that topic of conversation was able to be talked about on this list of topics of conversation because it has a tendency to like we start from the top or we start from the bottom, but science and medicine is kind of in the middle, and it tends to get a little bit lost in the concept. And so I want to go ahead and talk on that subject today. And again, I am over on YouTube as well. I have a panel or a webpage up on the YouTube that you can follow along in. This is just a couple of articles on my website that actually I have 5 litter boxes, because then my son brought a cat with him. And so I had 3 cats and he brought one. And so I had 5 litter boxes, because you always want to have an extra one. And I clean litter boxes on a daily fucking basis so that the house does not smell, because I cannot handle the smell. So it is definitely one of those things where you have to be extremely active and taking care of it. And that's actually like, we needed to, I got 3 kittens. I was trying to help somebody out who had kittens, and I couldn't separate them because their mother had died and they were like bonded to each other. And so that's why I have 3 cats, and they're all long hairs, which is a lot. And they're all white long hairs, right? So there's a lot of cat hair over my house and everything else. And I haven't wanted to separate them because they were a bonded set of triplets. And so I haven't really been able to find a home for a set of triplets. Nobody wants 3 long hair fucking white cats. Can't say I blame them. They're really sweet and very loving. But with my son moving in, he brought his dog and his cat with him. And, I wasn't going to ask him to not have his dog and his cat, because he's a child and he's going through a lot of trauma, and his dog and his cat have been really protective of him and safe for him. And so, I wanted to make sure that he had access to his animals. And so I've had to find new homes for my animals, and I had to separate them. And that for me has been the worst part, is having to separate them. Because of the fact being Native, comments throw me off. I'm Indigenous. I wouldn't identify myself as Native Americans, because though my grandmothers were both enrolled in tribes, I am not enrollable. And so I wouldn't claim to be a member of a nation. And being Native American is as much a part of being a member of a nation as anything else. But I have ties to nations across Turtle Island, both by blood and by raising and family members, right? So again, because my grandparents are, and I just wouldn't say that specifically, right? But I had to go ahead and, with the movement in, I had to go ahead and rehome them and find a new space to them. And Indigenous is a global thing. Native Americans are one of the Indigenous groups in the Western Hemisphere. Native Americans are the Indigenous nations that got colonized by actually specific nations, like got colonized by Great Britain. Those who got colonized by France, right, are First Nations, right? Those who got colonized by Spain, we tend to call, we have a lot of different, identifiers for those who were colonized by Spain, south of the Mexican-U.S. border, correct? And I'm not going to, there's so many different terms. I don't want to use one and have that be for, all of them, because that's just not appropriate. And so, and then if you look across the globe, we see that there are Indigenous nations across the globe. The Sami are an Indigenous nation in Northwest Europe who are in Scandinavia, actually, who have been under colonization for about 1,000 years, right? And Palestinians are an Indigenous nation who have been under colonization since they were called the Canaanites, about 4,000 years ago, right? And the Ainu in Japan are an Indigenous nation who actually look more European than Asian. Like they're kind of lighter skin and kind of, so the epithelial fold that goes in the inner corner of the eye that you see is an Arctic thing, right? And so it comes from people in Arctic regions, or a desert thing in desert regions. And what it comes from is when the sun hits snow or sand, it reflects back up into your face. And so, why are you using slurs in your threat? Like, why are you using slurs in your threat? That's so inappropriate. Why would you be trying to get me to admit something that I will never admit, because it has no basis in fact, only your delusion, and use a slur in it? INES is a slur. It is a slur. You should not use that ending on that word. It is a slur. So until I do what? You won't stop using slurs? Check yourself. Check yourself. So, the Ainu are an indigenous nation in Japan, and they have been, the ending of the word that he used, the last word in his sentence, and I'm not going to say it out loud, aboriginal is the correct term. But when you use INES, it is a slur that Australian people have been being unalived for quite some time, right? And that's just not appropriate, right? Not only that, he's trying to get me to go along with his delusion that unalives people as well, right? So, So the Ainu of Japan, and they actually have rounder eyes because they were not in the Arctic climates or the desert climates where the sun reflects back and causes that inner fold of the eyes, right? And which is why we also see that inner fold of the eyes in Arctic areas or desert areas across the globe, right? So you'll see that similarity across the globe. This is one of the reasons that phrenology or craniology is a BS pseudoscience, because it takes measurements of people across the globe and decides that, even though you might not be related to each other at all, you are absolutely related to each other because you have this measurement, right? So when we are looking at my history verified, verify your own. I have nothing to prove to you. You are the one coming to the table with things that are not accepted fact. You have everything to prove to everybody on the table. And until you can bring proof that is actually verifiable and actually holds what evidence and actually has weight, you have not proven jack. And y'all showing this or that or anything else on TikTok proves nothing to anybody. And the reason it proves nothing to anybody is because you can fake anything you want to, darling, and we all know it. So you have to the count of 3 to shut your mouth or get out of my chat. 1, 2, 3. Sit your ass down and shut your ass up. Get the fuck out. So when we are looking at, no, honey, back at you. When we are looking at indigenous peoples across the globe, we see that there are indigenous peoples in every space across the globe. The Ukrainians have been there since any human has been in that space, right? The Koreans have been there since any human has been in that space. And across the globe, we see that colonization has affected the medicine and science that were already there. Now, why do I say that science and medicine are indigenous? And how do I have proof that science and medicine are indigenous? Well, first, I have proof that medicine is practiced 31,000 years ago in Borneo, right? Proof that medicine is practiced among the Neanderthals. Proof that medicine is practiced on a global scale. And I can pinpoint to you the exact point where medicine stopped being practiced on a global scale. And when you know it, you'll know it, okay? So I can even take this back to Homo erectus, which is 2 million years old, our grandfather species, right? So with this, what I want to do is first explain what science in its base is, what it means to science, what this adjective, noun, this word is, right? Science is the act, right, of observing something in nature, making a prediction or a thought process based on that observation, and then making a prediction based on that thought process. So we have observation, thought process is hypothesis, okay? Making a hypothesis based on that observation, and that hypothesis, we predict the outcome, and we then test to see if our prediction of the outcome is going to fail or pass the test. If it fails the test, we have to go back to our hypothesis and think of a new prediction and test it again, and then go from there, right? If we I'm talking currently on science and medicine being Indigenous. My website is in my bio, and I'm also over on YouTube, and you can kind of see pages from my website on YouTube right now. But my website does go into violence being only 10,000 years old if we do not get to that today, Jesse, just so you're aware. When we are looking at testing, if the test proves true, then we have either a theory. We do not, game. We do not. So, so we're up at 61 and we're already seeing this issue. Let me go ahead and set the boundaries in my space. I don't usually do it until we get up to 100, but let me go ahead and set the boundaries in my space. My name is Sarah. I am a Widda. A Widda is a scientist. My science is anthropology, archaeology, the study of human evolution, the study of how we got where we are, and history and storytelling and education. I am unable to work. I'm a war vet. And because of being a war vet, I'm unable to work. And so instead of working, I bring in my knowledge that I could get a job teaching anywhere and sharing anywhere and give it away for free on the internet, because knowledge should be free. It shouldn't be gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall. And it should not, on any level, be gate kept with language that people don't understand. And it's really gate kept with language that people with extensive degrees have a hard time understanding sometimes, right? So because of that, I come into TikTok and I give some information. I was also sent here by siblings in Indigenous nations who were like, there's a lot of allies and accomplices out there who are trying to find ways to connect to their own ancestry without appropriating other people's culture, Waboos for one, right? But mainly they were at the time talking about the white ones. Can you go and show them how, like where they can find their own Indigenous ancestries and how to find their own space to follow their own ancestors without appropriating other cultures? And then I've also been, kind of instructed that it's my job to come in and teach, no matter whether or not y'all being like that, right? 1 second. I apologize. TikTok seems to be having an issue with my staying connected, right? It's not live bans or anything like that. It is, having problems with staying connected. So it will actually freeze on me and I'll have to leave and come back a few times. If you see that happen, that's why. So I've been tasked with coming in here and giving education. I can teach you, which I'm trying to do right now, how science and medicine predate us as human beings, right? I can show you how we evolved. I can tell you how we got to every part, every space. I can teach you that biologically we are all nurturing and communal, right? I can teach you that biologically we have 3 sexes, not 2, okay? I can teach you how the theory of race was debunked, because the theory of race was created by my field. It's a very racist theory, and it has been debunked by my field, right? And I can teach you that culture and ethnicity are still here and strong and beautiful and global, right? In my space, it's a safe space. We're not going to be using slurs. We're not going to be racist in my space. We're not going to do phobias based on gender and desire in my space. You won't like my response to those things because I don't deal with those things, period. And that's a boundary. TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers a space. You're more than welcome to go and get your own space and utilize your own space for what you want to. But I'm going to utilize my space for teaching. Now, there may be inaccuracies in my thing. Only an idiot claims to know everything. Let me repeat that. Only an idiot claims to know everything. Okay? I don't know everything. And I am in a field where things are changing every single day. In the last year, we have changed how we think we evolved. We have discovered a new species and a new ghost species in the last year. In my field, everything changes every single day. So I may be incorrect. But if you're going to tell me that I'm incorrect, you need to come to me with, you're incorrect on this subject due to this thing. Okay? I.e., Widda, you are incorrect that the Bering Land Bridge was the first way that Native Americans got to Turtle Island, which is totally incorrect. And I would never say. But if I were to say something like that, you might come back to me and go, Widda, you're incorrect on that, because this new study here shows that Indigenous people get to Turtle Island at 54,000 years ago. And I would go, wow, that's cool information. Do you have an article on that? Do you have something I can read on that? Now, if you're going to be in here trying to erase other people and trying to use your racist ideologies that are based on white supremacy talking points, I'm not going to buy your crap. And I know that there's a few of you already in here playing, but I don't buy. Okay, so you can see yourself out. I've already debunked your shit. It's shit. It's easy to debunk. Okay, so let's go back to science and medicine, right? Science and medicine, we can see as far back in as Homo erectus, because as far back in Homo erectus, we can see an observation of something happening in nature, a hypothesis or a thought process of what that observation might mean, and a prediction of how they might be able to come about something, test something, make that hypothesis come to fruition. And then you can see how they did that, how they tested it out, how they came about that. We can see this with our first discovery of the control of fire. Our first science, well, I kind of believe our first science is tools, but our first can't deny it science is knowing how to either make or control fire. And we can see that as far back as Homo erectus. Homo erectus's ability to make or control fire gave us the brains that we have. They gave us the clothing that you have. It gave you the tools that you have today. It gave you everything, really, because it is the usage of fire that makes us intelligent, because of the fact that if you cook your food, you get a more caloric intake for a smaller amount of food, right? So with that, we see that the ability to cook our food, right, and the ability to have the higher caloric intake for a less amount of food goes to brain development in neonates, people in the womb, and people in the womb does not mean that life starts at conception. Life starts at first breath. In everything that you can ever find, it's in the Bible at first breath. So life starts at first breath. People in the womb does not mean that they are life, right? When we look at brain development works off higher, like it needs calories to develop, right? It needs those excess calories to develop. And the more excess calories that you can get, the more development that you can get of the brain, right? So there are newer studies also that show that fermentation helped with this as well, that the brain development, you can get higher caloric intake from fermentation of food. And so this might kind of change a couple of things in the way that we're looking at things as we go along. Like the new human species might change a couple of things as we're looking at things as we go along. Now, when we see that Homo erectus has the ability to control fire, we see this as science, because to control fire, what you have to do is figure out how to control fire. And that takes test after test after test to get there. We don't know how they got to the point that they can control fire, but there are a couple of different ways that you might get to the point that you can control fire. So let me go ahead and go over those a little bit, and you can kind of see the science within them. So say I see a tree, and it's on fire because lightning has hit it. And there was a cat in the tree when lightning hit it. Big old lion. The fire roasts the cat because the cat gets shocked. He's dead. He's in the tree, right? And I smell the cooked meat, and I'm like, oh, that's good. Gotta get me some of that, right? Well, fire changed animal. Animal tastes better. Fire make other things taste better, right? To put it in very what others might perceive of Homo erectus thought, right? Though I personally, they have the patterns for vocal language in their brain, which means that Homo erectus had vocal language as well. So we see that Homo erectus, seeing fire on a tree, might conceive that if they take like a branch that's on fire back to their camp, they can cook something else. So they take a branch that's on fire back to their camp, maybe. Now, this might happen 2 or 3 times before they figure out that they have to keep the branch alive. They have to feed it more, right? And so they might be able to early on control fire on just by figuring out that if I bring a branch back to camp, right? If I bring and it doesn't let me not see the comments. I just want to say, like, it doesn't let me turn off the comments for myself unless I turn it to like subscribers only. It doesn't let me turn this shit off. If it gets bad, let me know. I have some bomb ass mods in here. Yet, if it gets bad, in fact, I need to re-add somebody as a mod because I don't think that they are. Yeah. So if it gets bad in here, let me know. Yeah, there are absolutely Afro-Indigenous people. Absolutely, 100%. I'm trying not to block people right now. Unless I'm personally having an interaction that I see with them, I'm trying just to not block people right now. So I turned off the ability to do that just because of the fact that it tends to lead to other things. Now, if I see something that's a problem, I can block them, but I'm just trying not to. Yeah, I probably could. Okay, so let's do that because I'm going to go ahead and I will for a while. I will turn these back on, but it gets very distracting for me, as anybody who's been in here long-term knows. And when it gets distracting for me like that, we end up on a whole other tangent. Like we've talked about 5 different things in the 28 minutes we've been going, instead of focusing on what I was trying to focus on, right? So I'll go ahead and turn them off for a while. So when we're talking about seeing science as far back as Homo erectus, the bringing fire back to camp and trying to figure out how to keep fire going in itself is, again, science. Again, science being at its base level, I observe in nature, okay? I have a thought or a hypothesis of what that observation might be. I observe fire in nature. Fire cooks meat in nature. Wow, I like cooked meat. Maybe if I take fire back to camp, I can cook my own meat. A prediction. I take fire back to camp, a test to cook my own meat, but fire dies out. So now I have to return back to fire cooks meat. Taking fire back to camp didn't work. Now I must add food to fire. I have to feed fire to feed me, right? So all of these steps are prediction, test. When the test fails, I go back to the hypothesis, predict a new thing. When the test fails, I go back. So through this, you might take fire back several times before you find you have to feed it. Then you need to know how to keep it going. Like, what if it dies out? How do I make a new one, right? So this might be either a coal. Earth's Children series actually talked about that one. And I read Earth's Children series really young, like I was 12, and it was amazing on it, right? And I was like, ha, that makes total sense. And being Indigenous and growing up in an Indigenous area, I had already known a lot of these things too. And I learned how to make a fire at like 5, learned how to cook over an open fire at like 5. And I learned how to, start with flint at 5, right? So I knew a lot of these things, but Earth's Children series really goes over it really well. When you're looking at keeping a coal alive, right? Now I decide I want to keep a coal alive because I know that I can start new fire from coal, right? So I keep a coal alive, or an ember actually, right? Because coal is kind of the dead version of it, right? Not the alive. So I keep an ember alive. Now, am I going to keep this ember alive? I know I have to feed it to keep it alive, but I know that if I feed it some things, it's just going to flare up and be gone, right? So first, maybe I put some moss around it. Maybe I just take it and put it on a stone, and that didn't work. So now I've put some moss around it because it needs to be fed, right? I know it needs to be fed, and it was in the wind. So maybe I put it in a bowl with some moss around it, but then it just kind of, right, just flares up. Oh, well, maybe if I put some damp moss around it with some dry moss with some damp moss, then maybe it'll have this buffer and it'll keep it going, but it'll keep it going on a low, right? Well, I need to make sure that it's not just sitting out in the open and getting too much air, because then it flares up, right? So all of these are processes of science. They are all test, fail, retest, test, fail, retest, right? All of these processes of science get to the point that by at least 1.7 million years ago, we see that Homo erectus is having the ability to move with fire, right? They are having the ability to create fire in their camps. They're having the ability to utilize fire. And it is that utilization of fire that cooks their meat, that gives the ability to get a greater caloric intake from a smaller amount, a smaller ounce, smaller, yeah, I guess weight, smaller weight of food. Now, this shows us that science goes as far back as Homo erectus. Science is also every new development that we get, corded ware, bow and arrow. Science is Clovis points, right? Every different step that we make in adjusting something to be better. Every animal, plant on this planet adopts its adaptations and adapts to its adaptations, right? The adaptations that you do to your environment are your niche in the biome, your part that you play in the environment, in the part that all of us are, right? So a plant's adaptations to the soil, the chemicals that they release that provide nutrients for other plants or nutrients for other animals, like bugs. Or I'm burpy, I guess. This is its niche in the biome. It is providing something to the rest of the biome, right? When we look at plants, they adapt their biome in these ways. We look at animals, we see that animals will build dens, they'll build homes. Beaver's been building the same dam for thousands and thousands of years. We see that corvids can make tools, right? They can put together tools. We are unique in the fact that we adapt our adaptations. Everything adapts the environment, and everything adapts to the environment. We adapt our adaptations. When we adapt the environment to us, we then work on that adaptation and build it further, move it further. Last year, they had an article that came out about how Homo heidelbergensis at 500,000 years ago in Africa had wood buildings. They had Lincoln logs, basically, that they found where they were notched logs put together, right? So we have been adapting our adaptations since we came onto the scene. It is one of the things that make us foundationally human. When we look at what human means, it is one of the things that is a foundational human trait. It is a base level trait in human, right? Whatever the species of human is, because the species of human are anything that fall underneath the genus Homo, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, Homo florensis, Homo heidelbergensis. Homo means human in Latin. And so anything that falls underneath that is a human species. Now, we can see medicine going as far back as Neanderthals so far. And many people have, and I always kind of refer back to this a little bit because it's just in popular knowledge. Many people have read Earth's Children series or watched Clan of the Cave Bear movies, right? What a lot of people don't know is that it was so accurate for its time that Jean M. All actually got her doctorate from several different universities. She's actually an honorary PhD at Portland State, where I've got my degrees from, right? And because she's an honorary PhD, or she's an honorary PhD there because the Earth's Children series was so accurate at the time. The Earth's Children series is all based on Shanidar Cave in Iraq. The Earth's Children series, we know of the old man from Shanidar Caves. So we call him Shanidar 1, or just the old man, right? Or the old man is Shanidar. Now, when we started DNA testing, we have two old men that we DNA tested. One didn't give us DNA, and the other one gave us female DNA, X and X, right? So the old men so far are women. And we do know now that Neanderthals, their size difference, like the average size of their females versus the average size of their males, and then what we call sexual diaphorism, which is the average difference in sizes, which one's on average larger. Average doesn't mean most. It doesn't mean all. It means average. Sometimes average doesn't even mean doesn't even come close to most. Sometimes average is a quarter of the population, just so you're aware what average actually means. But the average sexual diaphorism that we see in humans or Homo sapiens is that Homo sapiens are on average taller as males and shorter as females. Again, on average, we see a lot of very tall females. The Sami, 7 foot tall, she was called a shaman. Shaman is a Tungan word, and it actually comes from Asia, and it is for their spiritual leaders. So I don't know if that would be appropriate to address her as that, right? Or if that's how she would have been. I've frozen again. Be right back.
When I was a kid.
It likes to do that on me. I apologize. So the Sami woman that they found that was, and vulva would not be appropriate either because Sami are not, they're not Swedish and they're not Norwegian. That's a different language group and a different people, though they do speak those languages typically, right, because of where they've been colonized and who's been taking over their space, right? So she was 7 foot tall as a woman, and as a woman from several thousand or 1,000, maybe it was 1,500 years ago, as a woman from a while ago, right? Which always just makes it go. So the sexual diaphorism in Neanderthals, their women are larger than their men, it seems, from what we have found with when we finally are able to do DNA testing. So we don't know. What we do see with Kreb, the old man of Shanidar, from Earth's Children's series, that find is the find of an elder individual, 50 to 60 years old, who has they had one side of the right side, I believe it is, the right side of their brain or their head had been hit in an injury. And it meant that they were blind in one eye and deaf in one ear, and partially deaf on the other side. And then one of their arms had been, and I'm mixing them in my head. I'm mixing Shanidar and La Chapelle. So 1 second, I'm trying to make sure I'm getting Shanidar and not La Chapelle. I believe so there was atrophy in the right arm on Shanidar because of that head injury. And so he wasn't able to use his right arm by the time he was dead. And the same thing with one of his legs. And so he had to use a crutch to move around. This is a sign of medicine in humans and in Neanderthals because of the fact that to heal somebody from a head injury, you have to have somebody there willing to stay with them. You have to have somebody who is able to tend to them, able to feed them, right? Even if you're not utilizing herbs, even if you're not utilizing something like bandages, you still have to have that. Having a crutch that you're using to hobble around, right, is utilizing a tool to, work. We do know, though, as well, that Neanderthals have in the dentition on their teeth or the plaque on their teeth, the isotopes from herbs that are medicinal, that have no caloric value, and they're extremely bitter. So they're not stuff that you would be utilizing just to eat. They're stuff that you would be utilizing to eat for a specific thing. And oftentimes when we're finding isotopes of specific herbs in the plaque, we can then find within the DNA of the human associated illnesses that are today associated with those medicinal herbs. So we can see medicine as far back as Neanderthal. Shanidar 1 is 90,000 years ago to my memory. Sometimes I'm bad with dates and sometimes I'm bad with geography. So if I'm off on a couple of things, I apologize. I always try and correct if I can remember. And if you know the right ones and comments are on, feel free to let me know the right dates. These things show us science, medicine in humans before us. And it's important to recognize that it is Homo erectus's ability to learn how to control fire, learn how to manage fire, that gives you a cell phone, right? Because the steps from that, we had to have fire to get our larger brains, right? To get that thought process and to get the globular lobal brain that we have, the malleability within our brain, right? We had to have the larger brains to get to that point. And then we also needed the fire to get to like several different steps, right? It helps with any tool usage because it will actually temper wood, right? And then we're talking about tempering as we get further along and we start to see tempering within steel or tempering within different metals, right? All of those things take fire. Homo erectus doesn't find fire, the ability to control fire. We don't get to fire. We don't get to the steps along the road. Fire brings you the cell phone. Fire gives you the metal in the cell phone. Fire gives you the glass in the cell phone, right? So when we are looking at this, we can absolutely trace science this far back. We can absolutely trace medicine this far back. When we come to sapiens, we see that some of our first finds, I'm scrolling down over on YouTube, where I'm also streaming. I'm scrolling, and if the comments aren't on here and you want to comment, you can go to YouTube to comment as well. As I'm scrolling down on this, you'll see where I have an article on the bottom of this page under the Medicine in the Ancients tab under bibliographies. I have an article of Neanderthal medics, right? And it's talking about medicinal plants entrapped in the dental calculus, like I was just talking about. Some of the other articles on like the Neanderthals will show you evidence of medicine in the burials, or not in the burials, but in the life of the human themselves, like the broken bones or things like that. I'm going to go on to Skelly. Skelly is 31,000 years ago in Borneo, and Skelly is Homo sapiens. Skelly is 19 or 20 at the age of death, and Skelly had an injury 6 to 9 years prior where their foot needed to be amputated. Now, a lower leg amputation has a tendency to cause the body to go into shock. Lower limb amputations, any amputation of the lower limbs at any level has a tendency to send the body into shock. We've known this forever. We saw a lot during the Civil War. There was a lot of conversation, or there's always a lot of conversation of that, right? The fact that doctors didn't have enough morphine to give to enough patients, and we lost a lot of patients because they went into shock during surgery from amputations. So we know from the amputation itself, the fact that there is the amputation and then the survival. We know that she survived because there's bone remodeling on the end of her bone that shows 6 to 9 years worth of remodeling. Now I say her because biologically she is female. We don't know how she identified, but biologically we're going to go with that. So we see 6 to 9 years of remodeling on the end of the bone. So we know she lives for 6 to 9 years afterwards. This tells us, thank you. This tells us that she had to have some form of anesthetic. Sorry, I get these two confused words sometimes. Anesthetic to kind of put her under or kind of numb it or kind of do something. And we know that there are anesthetic herbs in the area that have been there for thousands of years that are indigenous to the area. So we believe, or the scientists that work on this find, which you can read about in this article, believe that she had to have anesthetic herbs that were how to make sure that we're going to make sure that she was under enough for them to do this amputation. We also can tell from the bone that there was no signs of infection. There was no signs that something got into the wound and caused problem. This tells us several things, in fact. One of the things that it tells us is that there was antiseptics used as well. So herbs around the area are antiseptic as well as anesthetic. And so we can see the use of some of those herbs either in, they're probably using these as a wash, maybe for the wound, maybe for the tools, maybe as a tea afterwards. There's several different ways that this could probably be used. When we're looking at the wound itself, we see that the wound itself, they used obsidian. Obsidian is something that can be sharpened so fine that it can cut between cells. Even today in microsurgeries, obsidian is the tool of choice by top name surgeons for microsurgeries, for microworking, because obsidian, again, can be sharpened so fine that it can cut between cells. So they get little scalpels of obsidian, right? Just a single flake of obsidian, right? Can you just imagine that glass, like the color of a single flake of obsidian? So we see that they use obsidian to cut through the bone, which means it's a very, or is because it's a very clean cut. We can see the cleanness of the cut, right? So here we have antiseptic use, anesthetic use, and the finest blade one can imagine, right? Because it's still used today. It's still high top dollar use today, right? In a child who would probably have been about 10 to 13 at the time, right? She was a young teen at the time. Now, you will see in the article that they talk about this, meaning that she obviously had some status within the community. I disagree. I think that this is a Western lens looking at Indigenous activity. Indigenous activity puts community ahead of self, and people's value to the community isn't necessarily based on a hierarchy, right? It's based on being a member of that community. And even if you are not able to contribute to that community in what somebody in a Western lens might think of as a contribution, right, or an active contribution, or in today's mind, an active contribution, you still have many contributions to make. And we see this in Indigenous communities across the globe when we see that elders are cared for constantly. There's no worry about your elders. If a child is an orphan, they are taken in by the community and raised by the community. Within Indigenous communities, we see that community is paramount, not your rank within community, but community itself, taking care of. It is a sense that it is the whole of the community is its own biome. And it takes every person and every member of community within that biome to function within that biome, right? It's a very animistic sense. And one of the definitions of being Indigenous per the UN is actually having that spiritual connection to the land and that communal connection to the land, which is that animistic sense, right? So I would disagree with this article on only one thing. It is the fact that I do not believe that she was a high value member of community or a high status member of community for them to perform this or to attempt the surgery. I personally believe that to get to the level that you can do a perfect foot amputation, because that is exactly what it is. I got sidetracked and failed to mention one other thing. The other thing that no infection in the bone shows us is that when they amputated, they had to have had enough understanding to cauterize the arteries to make sure that she did not bleed out. And they also had to have enough understanding to cover the end of the bone, which means that they had to take the skin and pull it up, slice here, and then when you relax the skin, it goes back down, or the flesh. And then you want to also make sure that you cut the skin itself, where you can take a flap of the skin and put it over the end of the wound. I was a radiographer before I did archaeology. I've been in on many surgeries, right? This is something that we do today, right? We don't see as fine of cut today's. Like in today's surgeries, most doctors don't use obsidian unless they're doing microsurgery because it is expensive, right? And so because of that, we don't see in surgeries, and it's very fragile if it's at a micro level, right? We don't see such a fine cut in today's surgeries. We don't see such beautiful surgeries in today's surgeries, right? It's almost elegant in its surgery. So this tells us that they knew anatomy enough to need to cover the bone, cauterize the veins, right? So that she didn't die. This is an extensive level of medicine. It's an extremely extensive level of medicine to be able to perform a perfect surgery. She did not die from this surgery, right? And she not only didn't die, but she was successful for 9 years, right? So with this shows us that you're probably seeing a broader community, and that in that broader community, there is a sense of medicine within that broader community that is pretty active, because this is not somebody's first surgery. And I would hazard a guess that they were probably taught by somebody whose first surgery it wasn't, right? Like, because of the level of knowledge that it takes, it's probably something that has been happening for at least a couple of generations, logically. And it is probably happened at least 3 times, 4 times beforehand. These things tell us that it had to have been a couple generations, and it had to have had some form of a broader community. Most communities around this time are 30 to 60 people. They're rather small, right? So that you can maintain your ability to care for each other. And then you also see that sometimes you have small communities that are a member of a broader nation. Think of small tribes or bands who are a member of a broader nation. The difference between the word tribe and band is important. And so I want to go ahead and point this out really quick. Tribe is a community based on genetic lineage. Think of the tribes of Israel. Your membership in that community, your citizenship within that community is based on whether or not you have the genetic lineage within that community. You can be anywhere across the globe. And if your parent is Judaic, if both of your parents are Judaic, then you are Judaic and you can claim citizenship in Israel. Versus band. Band is a community based on the needs of the community and the needs of the individual. There's not genetics involved in it. Think of like the United States, where if we really need you because you're a top level doctor, we'll offer you citizenship in the United States, the needs of our community. And if you really need us because something is going to happen to you if you don't come here, then we're supposed to, we don't always, right? We're a little sure we offer you membership in this community. We offer you citizenship within this community, right? So that is a band, a community based on the needs of the community. So communities that are either tribes or bands are going to be small, around 30 members to 60 members. And then you're going to maybe have broader nations, right? Several different people or communities who are living within, say, a valley, right? We see that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived together side by side in Iraq for 100,000 years. And in that 100,000, from 150,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. And in that time, they're in 2 caves, a 5-minute walk from each other. So you're looking at 2 bands living side by side in a broader nation thought process, right? Because at this time, we're also doing a lot of intermixing. So when we look at Skelly, she not only shows us that there is this exquisite surgery, but she shows us that this medicine to get to the point of understanding this surgery has been going on for at least, I would state, 2 generations minimum. And I would state she would have to have been, for 2 generations to be it would have to have been a broader community, right? A larger nation kind of community. If you're going to say it's been there for like 10 generations, then I can see that they've had to do this maybe 10 times to really know all the ins and outs. What blade are they using? What herbs are they using to anesthetize? You know, they probably lost a couple of people before they learned that they had to put them under, right? Like, so what different things are happening so that you can get to the point that you can perform this exquisite, perfect surgery. I am going to go ahead and turn the comments on for a while. We're at like 80 people, so it might be a little calmer in here. And I also want to give everybody the chance to ask any questions about Skelly or the Neanderthal medicine or the Homo erectus science that we just went over. Cancel, that's not what I wanted to do. I got to figure out which thing I'm trying to do right now, because I can't figure out which thing I'm trying to do right now, because when I turn them back on, I'll probably turn them to sub only. So that we can actually get to a, or so that I can read back through any questions that are there. If I have to turn them back off. Sometimes I don't have to turn them back off. And so when that's it, I like to leave them on so I can go through them, right? Absolutely welcome. I froze again, YouTube. I did freeze again. And I do hear that my chillin is out of the bathroom. Let me see if I can get this to go back. So I am going to run really quick. Skelly was found in Borneo. Give me about 2 minutes and I'll be right back. I can pee quick. is walking good today, so I could make that fast. I don't think that Bigfoot is a ghost species. I do, however, think that Bigfoot is out there. I come from the Pacific Northwest, and you're going to be hard pressed to find somebody in the PNW who does not believe that Bigfoot actually exists, right? Hi. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate that. Absolutely, Stargazer. So now I know that because a professor taught me that in school. My understanding, I think Shanidar is one of them, but I'm going to have to go and kind of look. And I think that there's actually on my bibliographies, I think that there is, let me see if I can find where it is. It used to be on my, my page or when I had like a list link tree or whatever it was. It used to be on there, but and really you're not going to find it in the same article, right? You're not going to find an article that's like humans and Neanderthals live side by side. What you're going to find is an article about a cave about Neanderthals, and you're going to go, that cave is right here. And then you're going to find an article about a cave about Homo sapiens and go, that cave is right here. And that's really what my my teacher did with it. There is an article that I had somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where it is, that talks about open air living. It says something about living open air and side by side in Iraq at the time. And I think that has to do with the two caves. And that's the closest that I found of an article that actually talks about, that space itself. But I'm not exactly sure where I put the article in the bibliographies. I'll have to see if I can find it. But I do know that there's one on that. And then I do know, I will look and double check whether or not it's Shanidar Cave for the Neanderthals and which one it is for the Neanderthals. And then I can probably find from there which one it was from the Homo sapiens, so that I can give a little bit more detail on that statement, because it is one that I've made a few times. And so, well, I have sources for it, I don't know if I have like the detail and the evidence down to point, right? Oh, okay. I have to verify to continue. TikTok be whack these, like, it's been weird. It's been real fucking weird, like real weird. Like, I don't know why I dropped like 10 times during a live, and I certainly don't know why. Like, that's like the fourth or fifth time that I've had to do one of those slides to say that you're still active in your live. And it's like, you don't see me talking? Like, my face isn't enough, right? I think Neanderthals didn't disappear because they're in us. There's actually more Neanderthal DNA on the planet today than there ever was during their time as a species, because their time as a species, they were a small species. They didn't have a lot of genetic diversity, and so they maintained a small species. And they, I think, so they think that by the time Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, like by the time sapiens are really interacting with Neanderthals in Europe, that Neanderthals are about 10,000 left. And because of this, they were very inbred in Europe at this time frame, like at 40, 50,000 years ago. And we're seeing, uncles and nieces getting married and stuff like that. And because of this, we all know, every human species knows that inbreeding is bad. And because of that, I personally think that Neanderthals were like, hey, new genes. Let's get some, let's bring some of them new genes in. And because Neanderthals are like, hey, let's get some of them new genes, we learned a lot of shit from them. And then we also got a lot of capabilities to live in Europe from them, and in Northern Asia from them, and really across the globe from them as well. And then I also think that, like, they didn't die out. They just became enveloped in us. I don't think any of these species that we see in us, like the 7 ghost species, one we see in Neanderthal and Denisovan, so that one, yes. But seeing Neanderthal and Denisovan in us tells me that they didn't die out. They're still here. It's just a little fragment of them, right? You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, it's weird. Like, I've had TikTok like legitimately shut the whole thing down. Legitimately shut the whole thing down. I'm not sure. Stargazer, that's crazy. Is there a reason that they didn't point this out? And I'm not sure which this you're talking about, because it came through a minute ago. Well, that might be real. Though it's not all I do. I mean, last time they didn't want me to talk about watermelons, right? Last time they didn't want me to educate on who is indigenous to certain areas of the globe and who is colonizing certain areas of the globe and how unaliving people is unacceptable. No matter where you are, no matter what you claim, unaliving others is unacceptable, right? I mean, self-defense is always acceptable. But let's clarify in that scenario that watermelon has been acting in self-defense for over 4,000 years at this point. So it is, and that's 100% what it is. It is absolutely. Oh, really? I swear it's just bubbly. I'll sit to the side though. I know I can't take medicine on here. Well, last time I really believe it was just because of the fact that I get a lot of people who are pro creation instead of evolution and anti-science. And I've always, on every account that the last account especially, and even in the very start with this account and still to this day, like I get a lot of people who report videos where it's extremely, like I have had to learn how to say things in a way that doesn't get, problematic for TikTok itself. I'll be correcting, like earlier when somebody used a slur and I'm trying to correct the slur and people are like, that's hate speech. And I'm like, no, that was hate speech. This is not, like this is love. So I had to learn to speak it in a better way, right? Which is good. I'm always trying to learn to speak in a better way anyways. So the last one, like literally I was on like my account was on a warning, like the entire time I had the account. Like I had the account for a year and a half and it was maybe 2 years. And the entire time it was on warning. So yeah, allegedly. I love allegedly. That's my cousin's favorite word. They say allegedly all the time, but that comes from battles we've both been in. No, it is not human nature to be warlike. So, first of all, let me finish on the science and the medicine. If there are no more questions on the science and the medicine, right? Or on those three things, didn't say, hey, these caves right next to each other. So what I think it is that you've got a couple of different people studying them. And there are like people like my teacher. So Dr. Melanie Chung was Chang, not Chung. I apologize. That was completely inappropriate. Dr. Melanie Chang is the PhD in anthropology who taught, or paleoanthropology. She's like world renowned, who taught me and Neanderthals and paleoanthropology. And she's the one that gave me that information. But her papers and her works focuses on gender in Neanderthals and different things like that. And so she wouldn't be writing a paper on that focus. Whereas somebody has to come in, who maybe focuses on the interplay between the two to actually start writing a paper. So I'm sure that there is part of it that is racially motivated, right? The concept of, well, this is a different species, blah, 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 blah. It's not race at that point, but still, right? It's about well, we can't be them. I must be perfect and pure, right? There's another part, I'm sure, that is just because there's nobody specifically working on that, right? Instead, they're working on the focuses of where Neanderthals and our tools overlap, or like where we learn things from them, like the painting and this stuff. Well, we haven't even touched on, did we learn cave painting from Neanderthals? They started it first. Is it something we picked up from them? Like a lot of people don't even touch on those things. Yeah, they'll ban me for a lot of stuff. They ban me. Well, and I've literally had a picture of it's a statue in a museum, or a wax figure in a museum, and it's a Neanderthal mother and child, and it is from 30,000 years ago. It's Gibraltar Cave on the very southern tip, like it's like a very southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, like right across from the Horn of Africa, Gibraltar Strait. So in a cave in Gibraltar, they have found a Neanderthal mother and I think he's 7. The son is 7, right? Mother and son, and they have a wax figure, and she's not wearing anything on her top. Right. She's got like a breechcloth, I guess would be the best estimation of what they're trying to do with it. And I think he doesn't even have anything on, maybe just like a wrap around his waist, like a cord around his waist. And I've gotten banned for that. And it's like, okay. And the first time I got banned with it, I went, okay, so I'm just going to put some words in a couple of key spaces. And that seemed to work. But then I got banned for promoting sexual content. And it's like, there was nothing. The only thing that I said in that was, we all like admixture. If we see something new, we get it on, right? Like, it's the only sexual content you're getting from me, right? And so I just figure, they just have problems. It's easy for them to take those problems and find a way to, cause problems within it. Let me get back into the science of medicine being indigenous, though. And we talked about where we see medicine in the archaeological record a little bit. We also should note that we have an amputation of a forearm in the Arabian Peninsula area roughly 7,000 years ago. I think it's the Arabian Peninsula area off the top of my head. And then we have, I want to say it's like the word in my head is Middle East, but it's not exactly the correct word anymore too, right? So we have in ancient Egypt, we can see that there's a full hip replacement in ancient Egypt and a full knee replacement in ancient Egypt in the mummies. And the full knee replacement is like this ball with a spiral. They're all in silver because silver is antimicrobial, right? So they're very beautiful artistic pieces, and they're, thousands and thousands of years old. Like I think we're looking at 4,000 years old, right? When we see those things, we can see, and there's also like they have taken with cheeks and kind of like scraped off a bit of the cheekbone and scraped off a bit of the chin to adjust the looks, and they've healed. So this is plastic surgery in high-ranking women in Egypt, right? This we see within, Egyptian documents. We see medicine. We see medicine within the documents in, the first writings, right? All of our early writings talk about different forms of medicine, right? We also see medicine in the ancient Greeks. We see medicine in the ancient Romans. And that is in the Eurasian continent. We also know that when you look at Otzi the Iceman, the tattoos on Otzi are all along meridian lines that are associated today with acupuncture. They're all lines and dots, which is something that medical tattooing does today as well. And that the ink used to tattoo Otzi's tattoos, which was also replenished, like they were tattooed again and again and again from the same kind of ink, was actually plant matter of herbs that help with specific ailments that we actually found in Otzi that have been burned. And then the charcoal from that was tattooed. Charcoal from that was tattooed into his body. So we see that Otzi is using ancient Asian medicine, actually, or what we know of today from Asia, right? We, of course, see medicine throughout all of Asia, throughout all of the ancient, right? Which makes perfect sense why we find this full foot amputation in Borneo, right? Absolutely. Trepanation of skulls is also a global thing, right? And we can see with all of these things that this continues in all of these spaces until a significant event happens in each of these spaces. And that significant event is Christianization. In every space, we see medicine and science. We see metalworking. We see glassworking. We see, new pottery styles. We see a development and a change of our tools, adapting our adaptations, right? We see this continue across the globe until Christianity comes in each and every space. Why is at 400 years ago, when Constantine decides to use and appropriate this burgeoning religion, right, where a young man is saying, my religion, you are not doing this right. You're supposed to be doing this better. And he uses that after killing anybody associated with that young man for 300 years, 400 years, right? He utilizes that thought process to state that he should be the sole emperor of an empire that has more than one emperor. He wants to be the sole person in charge. And because he wants to be the sole person in charge, he is bringing this religion up. Now, Judaism does not hate science and medicine. Judaism has science and medicine, right? So he twists this concept into something that does not allow questioning. And the reason that he twists this concept into something that doesn't allow medicine or questioning is because of the fact that if you're questioning this, you're questioning me. If you start questioning what the fuck's going on, you might wake up to the fucking problem. All right? If you start thinking, you might think yourself into a revolution. And so Constantine decides that we can't question science and medicine. And of course, there are a lot of early church leaders that really double down on this, right? Constantine also throws out the women in the church because the women are very prevalent in Judaism and the women are very prevalent in early Christianity. Women are very prevalent in early Islam, right? So he throws those thought processes out and he instills a thought process that if you're practicing science, you're questioning God, not him, but God. If you're practicing medicine, you're playing God, right? And this gets doubled down over the course of a couple of centuries until it becomes this thought process that science and medicine are the work of the devil. They're questioning of God, and we have lost all thought of science and medicine within the spaces that the church has taken over. Now, of course, this starts in Rome. Froze again. You froze again. Now, of course, this starts in Rome and in all the places that Rome has colonized at this time. And then as those places start colonizing the rest of the world, they take them with them. When Europeans land on the Taino people, the Arawak, in Abiyala, right, we see that the indigenous people here have medicine and science documented by the Europeans. They document that they're able to heal their people, right? They talk about these ceremonies. Now, of course, they talk about these ceremonies as if they're hoopla, as if they're fantastical, as if they're nothing that actually is working, right? And yet all of the herbology that was being used by people here across Turtle Island and Abiyala is herbology that then went on to create 90% of the medicines that you have today, right? Most of them have plant medicine in them. And plant medicine is herbology. And most of these herbs are herbs that were being used already, like white willow bark in your aspirin, right? Like the use of different medicines to heal pain, right? All of these different, yes, absolutely, and things like that. We also see that there are surgeries in Turtle Island and Abiyala, right? Like the trepanation that we were just talking about. There's evidence of set bones all over the place. There's evidence of, I don't think I have evidence of an amputation off the top of my head. Doesn't mean it's not out there. I just haven't found it. I don't typically study Turtle Island and Abiyala directly. Like I grab new information for people so that I can help people when Western science is confirming Indigenous science and Indigenous medicine and Indigenous histories, right? So I grab information for that, but I don't typically study here. I typically study paleoanthropology, which is a lot earlier. And I also study a lot of European stuff because I grew up knowing Indigenous Turtle Island stuff. And I look for my other ancestries and, understand my other ancestors as well, right? Because I'd rather learn Turtle Island Indigenous stuff from Turtle Island Indigenous people than anybody else any day of the week, right? So when we're looking at that, we see that Europeans absolutely see science and medicine here, and they document science and medicine. It's actually why they shift into the thought process that it's not religion alone that is the problem, that you can be of another religion and not be of the devil or not be of evil, right? Because before they see the Turtle Islanders and the Abiyalians, they equate other religions with being of the devil, and therefore they can equate science and medicine of being evil, bad, right? Yet when they get to the Taino and they're up and down the East Coast, they document in all of this the very noble, very caring, very I'm more looking for words, but my brain's not pulling them up because it's got other words in it. So they find a people that is very they document, the tended garden from north to south, east to west, right? The entire continents, both of them are tended gardens, right? They document seeing medicine being practiced. They document the science of the husbandry of corn, right? I love to compare the husbandry of corn to the husbandry of wheat, right? These are both plants that started roughly the same size. And they're both grains that started roughly the same size. And one was hurt with Western-based monocrop agriculture. And so while it got larger, it's still very stunted in its larger, whereas one was encouraged with tending and with, three sisters with an understanding and a love, right? And that courage, we get corn, which is huge compared to wheat, even though they started at the same size, right? So we can see in corn a lot of science, even in that, right? And we also see, oh, please don't bring your God in my chat. Now, yes, I talked about what happened with your deity, right? Well, we don't, That's MPD right there. It teaches you all to parent abusively, and I don't want to have nothing to do with it. So please keep it out, right? So when we are looking at the landing, the attack, the invasion of Turtle Island and Nabiala, the Europeans are absolutely documenting science and medicine. And in the husbandry of the land, I mean, it's taken Europeans up until now and appropriating it from indigenous people and calling it permaculture for Europeans to get the science of tending the land correctly, right? So we can see that across the board, there's evidence of science and medicine going back as far as Homo erectus and Neanderthals. And we can see that they stay in places across the globe for millennia, millions of years, until fear comes into those spaces and colonization comes into those spaces, right? And when colonization comes in and fear comes in, we see that they become eradicated. And we see that when they start being developed again within Western society appropriates from other cultures without really understanding other cultures in their drawing back on other cultures to relearn science and medicine, which they lost. And unfortunately, it means that today in the United States, medical racism is prevalent. Medical racism is prevalent in medicine today. We see that maternal mortality in the United States is higher than in any other industrialized nation across the world. And we see that that high rate is predominantly among Black and brown women. We see that medical racism really kills everybody, or kills people from every population every year. It is most prevalent with Black and brown people. And part of that is within the racist science of medicine that states to this day, to many doctors, even though medicine no longer states this and science no longer states this, that the color of your skin dictates the levels of pain that you feel, and that you can tolerate more pain if you're darker. And because you can tolerate more pain if you're darker, then you're just being hysterical. Because of that, we see that Black and brown women die at a high rate in maternal mortality. We also see that people who are considered to be people of color across the board, or by whoever is treating them, will have a tendency to not be heard, to end up with heart attacks because they weren't heard, strokes because they weren't heard. People are sent out of an ER as they're having a heart attack because, well, you obviously aren't feeling this pain because your skin is so dark that you don't feel pain, in my opinion, and therefore you must be just drug seeking or hysterical, right? So we see within this, well, yes, we also need to make sure that that thought process is eradicated, right? Just replacing it with ain't no culture, color, or creed at this point that does not have internalized greed. And well, you cannot be racist against white people. We are all taught racism within the structure, and we all have this thought process that we're indoctrinated to. That, I mean, there are doctors who are dark of skin who will think that people who are dark of skin don't feel as much pain, right? Because they've been indoctrinated into that thought process. So will I 100% and will always support that we need way more Indigenous and Black people in medicine and science within the United States, 100%. It is only when we get Indigenous and Black people within medicine and science within the United States that we are going to advance in any way, shape, or form, because everything is better when you have multiple perspectives. Everything is better when you have multiple perspectives, right? So when we are seeing that, right, everybody migrated everywhere except for Africa. And then they just all migrated within Africa. So migration is global. Sorry, it just is. When we are seeing that, right, it is way more that we need to eradicate the concepts than it is. I mean, no, I don't like the way that's phrased. We must eradicate the concept for that to even take effect, right? Like, yes, having more Black and Indigenous doctors and scientists will start to introduce the eradication of the concept. As long as they don't carry that concept in with them, we have to eradicate the concept, right? Because it's only by eradicating the concept that we can get rid of it. And I know that you're saying this, and some of the things that you've stated, obviously you're really still in that concept. If you were not in that concept, you wouldn't have stated that they're not you, they're people who migrated here. You are still in that concept that race matters. You still think race exists, and you still think it's about us versus them, instead of all of us together against the upper class, against those in power. You still are buying into the concept of othering that created the theory of race that is causing the issue. So you can say all you want that we need more of this in there, but you yourself are proving that it's not just that, it's the entire concept. KYA means thousands of years ago. So K as in thousands, 100, we all know 100K is like 100,000, right? And then years ago, basically. When we're all human. The theory of race was debunked because the theory of race states that your phenotype dictates your genes, which it does not. And it also states that depending on what your phenotype is, depends on, intelligence, pain levels, abilities, right? And level of evolution, right? It was a concept that was created by the field that I am in, and it's a concept that the field that I am in is working very hard to eradicate. And it was eradicated when real science comes into play, because it is based on pseudoscience. The theory of race is based on pseudoscience. And when real science comes into play, and they do full genome testing, they see that there is more genetic difference within a primary population than between primary populations. And that is a lot of, large words that sometimes can be really hard for me, even like we all stumble over things and stuff. So I'm going to use some numbers that are easy for me to manage to explain that. If the entirety of the human genome is 100 genes and everybody gets 25, you and your next door neighbor have been in this space for 100,000 years, or 70,000 years, or 50,000 years, or 10,000 years. And you have genes 1 through 25, and your next door neighbor has genes 75 through 100. But somebody who is in another space completely across the globe, say you're one of the Khoi people in South Africa who have all the genes of the whole human genome within their population. So this is possible. You have 1 through 25 and they have 1 through 75 through 100, right? Somebody in Sweden is going to have genes 1 through 25. You're more genetically similar to somebody clear across the globe than you are to your next door neighbor. And that makes sense to anybody who stops and thinks for a hot second. We know that if you have children with somebody who is genetically close to you, your cousin, your sibling, that your children are going to have genetic mutations, because when the same genes meet, they mutate. So genetic mutations come from having too much genetic similarity in your population, right? Too much genetic similarity in your breeding population. And so you want to have more genetic diversity within a community so that you maintain genetic diversity in the entire species, so that you have the ability to not be inbred and breed your species out, right? It's toxic to the species to have to inbreed. That's why the Neanderthals came to us to get some new genes, right? So we also know with the Whole Genome Project that we can see every single gene in the human genome within the Khoi population of South Africa. Khioisan is a slur. They prefer it not be used. So they prefer either Khoi or San. So if you can't pronounce the clicks, I cannot pronounce clicks. I can roll my R's every day of the week, but I cannot pronounce clicks. I prefer the term race as a colonial construct, because it's something that othering is a colonial thing, right? The need to keep people hating each other instead of recognizing what's going up top, right, is a colonial construct. So I think of it as a colonial construct. I'm not hating on the term social construct, but I think that social construct kind of gives us the thought process that it's something that develops in main societies. I don't think it develops in society typically. I think that it's something that is taken or is something that's been developed by people trying to maintain power, right? The violence being 10,000 years ago kind of ties into that. So let me go ahead and talk about that, because we have, kind of finished on science and medicine are indigenous and kind of talked about how, we saw that becoming kind of outlawed across the globe and a little bit of the rise in it. So are there any other questions on that concept, though, before I move on to the rise of violence being 10,000 years old? RH and negative and positive. So RH negative and positive isn't anything. All it means is, so they don't type your blood by going into your blood. They type your blood by looking at the antibodies that are on the surface of the blood. And one set of antibodies on the surface of the blood are ABO. And that's what they named those antibodies. In the ABO antibodies, everybody is AB or O. And there's another set of antibodies on the surface of the blood, and those set of antibodies are called Rh antibodies. And the Rh antibodies, there's like 49 Rh antibodies. And if you do not have Rh capital D, you are considered Rh negative. And the only thing that this affects is that on your second child, you will have developed second child who has RhD in their blood or on the surface, the antibody, again, antibodies. And antibodies like to attack things, right? Like, oh my God, you're a disease, I'm going to attack you. So the second child that you have that has the RhD in their blood or on the surface of their blood, our body goes, you're a disease, I have to attack you, because you just developed antibodies to that. Right, you just developed what you need to kind of get rid of that from your first pregnancy. And so that's the only thing Rh affects, and that's the only thing Rh is. We like to think of it as this big thing because it seems to prove this or it seems to prove that, but it doesn't. There are 4 populations, I think, across the globe where 19% of the population has Rh negative. Every population across the globe has Rh negative, though. right? 19% is the highest, and there are 4 populations with 19%, but everywhere else has RH negative, and everywhere else, I think it's between like 5 and 19% across the globe, right? So every population has RH negative within it, and it really doesn't, and it's not even genetic. It's not even genetic. And it's not even really genetic. And it's the fact that it's not genetic that we know about it. We wouldn't know about it if it was genetic, because it's the fact that it doesn't automatically. I've seen different actually than that. It doesn't do that because it's automatically, sorry. We see that it's not genetic because it's the fact that it doesn't automatically pass down to your child to be Rh negative that actually caused us to become aware, because we became aware of it when somebody would have a good first pregnancy, but perpetually lose their children mid-pregnancy afterwards. And then we were like, well, what the heck is wrong with this person, right? And so when they started really getting into the study of blood types and stuff like that and started looking, they were like, oh, well, that's what's wrong. This person has that, doesn't have that antibody, and this person does have that antibody, or their child does have that antibody. So it's not even something we're passing down to our children, because if we were passing it down to our children, then we would be able to have the children, right? We wouldn't be attacking the children that have it, right? You can pass it down. It's just not that it's priority, like not priority. It's less about the genes, right? Because of the way that it works. I don't think that they have ideas on why. They look at a lot of things. Like I just saw an article today that I haven't read into too much, but it was talking about they have found some diseases within Homo Neanderthal and ancient Homo sapiens that they think that it was these genes, like it's not genes, it's no, it is. Okay, so it's like, I don't remember. It started with an H, and I don't remember what the next one is, but they think that it's, they think that the disease process, and again, I just read this article today, so I'm trying to make sure I explain it the most correct. They think that the disease process caused this antibody in our body, and that antibody triggered the gene, or it caused the development of the gene in the RNA within our body. And that's why we get some of our mental illnesses today. Like they're saying that that's where depression is coming from in this article. So, and again, I have to read it again and really go into it, but it's just to show that, yes, they do think that, you know, some of these things are coming from different things that we've gone through, right? A different, you know, when we talk about the rise of violence, I talk about how I think the rise of violence is also the rise of MPD within us, right? When a gene is triggered or is developed, right, there are mutation, and mutations can happen with trauma, right? Whether it's a disease from trauma, or it's, you know, like maybe you're running into a substance that traumatizes your body. Genes can change and mutate due to trauma, right? And so having experiences, they can, as they're studying genetics, they're starting to be able to develop where these genes are coming from and how they're coming into us. Which I'm not into genetics very well. Like genetics is not something I like. I can understand genealogy, but genetics is less so, right? So I can't, like, not the best explanation of it. You know that we've been piercing our bodies as far back as Neanderthals. The identification of self that comes from being aware that there is a self starts with decorating our bodies. And that is the consciousness of self, which means that the thing that makes you human, that everybody accepts as, you know, the consciousness of self is what makes us human, blah, 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 because we're so much better than everybody else, right? That thing that you think that makes you human, that consciousness of self, is decorating your body. And if you're not, that's something that you should probably explore, because actually self-declaration to express the self, the id, this, the conscious of self, the I am, self-declaration to express that actually makes life a lot easier sometimes, because you can weed out the assholes. So, and when we're looking at the and then you're talking to me, I didn't say protein. And I actually stated that I don't know why some people in every population are lacking RHD out of the 49 RHs that there are. Y'all put too much weight on what RH negative means. Anybody who's O negative is RH negative. Anybody who's B negative is RH negative. Anybody who's A negative is RH negative. Right? That's all it means. It means absolutely nothing on the grand scheme of things. People want to put a lot of weight in it because they think it proves ancient aliens, or they think that it proves, certain people are the true people of another place, right? But it really absolutely does nothing. It proves nothing. It just doesn't. People are like the Basque have the highest population. No, they don't. They just don't. By population percentage, there's 4 that have 19%. And none of them are the Basque. Right? Like, people want to think that it proves something. It's weird to me that it proves ancient aliens to people, because like ancient aliens is supposed to prove that we have alien DNA in our DNA, but this is the absence of something. So how would the absence of something prove a presence of something, right? Yeah. So the first pregnancy, you can usually make it through, and the first pregnancy develops the antibodies. And then the next pregnancy, you have to take shots throughout the pregnancy. The bubonic plague actually did cause a lot of mutations to our knowledge. We see actually, they found evidence of the bubonic plague like 10,000 years ago. Like, the bubonic plague is really actually very old within us. I do not. Oh. So let's go ahead and talk about the rise of violence, why I say that violence is 10,000 years old. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the rise of violence in YouTube so that you can see. I really only have a couple of articles on this. And again, I compile different articles so people can read the article and get an idea to start their own research. I don't do research for other people. It's your job to do your research for yourself. I'll help you figure out how to do the research, and I can help you understand things. If you are having a hard time, I often have a hard time understanding some things, and I have to kind of read through it a little, or look at something different, or try and figure out what it says. And sometimes, like, people will think that the abstract is the article. The abstract is never the article. In fact, the abstract is rarely what the article states. It's stating what the article wants to prove or disprove. It doesn't actually state what the article does prove or disprove, right? So if you see like an abstract that says that so-and-so used to say this 40 years ago, and then you take so-and-so saying this 40 years ago, is what's the thought process now, because you haven't read through the article and looked at the conclusion that says that the person that stated this 44 years ago was pseudoscience and debunked, then you don't know that the person that stated that 44 years ago was pseudoscience and debunked, right? So I can do a few of those things, right? But not, like, I'm not here to do research for people, but there are a couple articles on the rise of violence and why I state that the rise of violence is 10,000 years ago, roughly. And what I mean by this. So somebody said earlier that we see evidence of violence prior to this. And the thing is we don't see evidence of things that are definitively violence prior to this. Prior to, and I think it's 10 to 12,000 years ago, we don't see things in the archaeological record that can be definitively attributed to violence. What we see is roughly 2% of the 2,000 individuals that we have in the archaeological record prior to 10,000 years ago. There is things that can be attributed to violence. So 2% of the 2,000 have things that could be possibly attributed to violence. Now, what are things that could possibly be attributed to violence? If I see a skull that looks like it has been hit in the back with a stone, I can't tell you whether or not a human hand welded that stone and hit somebody in the back of the head, or whether or not a rock fell from a cave ceiling and hit somebody in the back of the head. I can't tell you how that got there. I know of a point, right? A spear point in somebody's thigh at 30,000 years ago. The angle of the spear point is weird. So you can't say that that looks like absolutely somebody stabbed that person. The angle of the point is kind of like a downward, like a flush almost. So it could be that somebody stabbed somebody in a leg, or it could be a hunting accident where, you know, your buddy hit you in the leg by accident. Or it could be a flint knapping accident. Flint knapping can be really dangerous. It's sharp, and, you know, sometimes you lose control. So maybe you lose control of that spear because of the way it is. It's like, here's your thigh, here's your hip bone, and it's like down in like this. So it could be a flint knapping accident, right? It could be several different things. And one of the things it could be is violence. So you can't say that it's violence if it can be attributed to other things, unless you have something that definitively says violence. 10,000 years ago, we see 8 people lined up in Kenya, and their hands are bound at the wrist. One of them is a pregnant woman. They're sitting cross-legged on the ground. The pregnant woman's hands are bound underneath her belly, and they're all hit from behind. That is definitive violence. Somebody tied you up and somebody hit you from behind, right? So at 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, we see a rise of violence in the archaeological record. 18 to 20% of the finds starting at that point in time show things that can be definitively attributed to violence. This rise of violence correlates with the rise of agricultural-based cities. It also correlates with the rise of monocrop agriculture. So when we see that this rise of violence correlates with the rise of monocrop agriculture and the rise of, I just said it, the rise of agricultural-based cities, we can see that the rise of agricultural-based cities kind of lends to this rise of violence. The rise of agriculture kind of lends to this rise of violence, right? The reasoning between this is a period of time where we start owning land, where we start defining property, right? Land is something that can be owned. We don't really see this before then, right? You might have your home, but it's the home that you and your community have shared. And most likely you and your community have shared that home for hundreds of years, right? Caves typically have hundreds of thousands of years. Like, you'll see thousands of years of evidence of people living in the same spot. It is completely normal to see 100,000 years of evidence of people living in the same spot. We see in Denisova Cave evidence of people living there from like 200,000 years ago to 23,000 years ago, right? Land ownership is absolutely, it's not a European concept. It's Middle Eastern concept. We call this Western-based, right? But it doesn't come from Europe. It comes from it comes from Mesopotamia. It comes from the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent. Part of this is because most of the world was under ice at this time, right? From the last mini ice age, right? And stuff like that. Yes, though it actually takes a few thousand years. It really does take a few thousand years. The rise of agriculture is also when humanity starts shifting from women-led to men-led. Yes, it does take a few thousand years, though. So the rise of violence is 10,000 years old. Ancient Egypt is like 6,000. Oh, fuck. I don't have any of my books right now, so it's so hard to confirm some stuff. I want to say it's about 6,000 years old is when we see King Scorpion, right? Pharaoh Scorpion, the first king of ancient Egypt, Kemet, right? On the ancient list of kings, there's 17 queens in their own right. Our first author was a woman in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, there were queens several times on the rolls of kings and queens, right? Yeah, no. And that's the thing. Well, and what it is the shift from being indigenous, right? It's a shift from the animistic sense. So one of the definitions of indigeneity per the UN is having that animistic connection to the land, right? That sense of spiritual, communal connection to the land, right? So this is where we see that shift from that animistic connection of the land that is happening in this area into a thought process of owning the land, right? That we do end up seeing translated down into Eve, right? Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, in the first chapter talks about the differences between Sky Woman and Eve. And in it, it talks about Eve being ejected from the garden, punished to wander, instead of being a co-creator of the good green earth, right? And this is really that difference is right there, right? That difference is right there. Being an outcast from the garden to struggle through on your way home versus being a co-creator of the good green earth. I would not personally say native, I say indigenous, but yes. When we are looking at the rise of violence in this space, what we're seeing is that monocrop agriculture starts roughly 18,000 years ago along the Nile. And along the Nile, monocrop agriculture really works. And it really works because the Nile floods every year, right? So you see that this continual, I'm claimed by plenty. I don't just claim I am. Just for the clarification. So you see along the Nile when there is a continuous replenishment of the earth, this continuous replenishment of the earth in the yearly floods gives nutrients back to the earth. And it also kind of clears the area out every year, right? There's not a lot of things will grow along this. So when they're planting monocrop agriculture along the Nile, in the beginning of planting monocrop agriculture along the Nile, the monocrop agriculture really works along there. In the fertile lands in Mesopotamia and in Ur and the Fertile Crescent at this time, there are some areas that do yearly flood. Not all of them do. Our first monocrop agricultural city is based in Engazal along the River Jordan, and it's roughly 9,000 years old. And we see with this city that they start utilizing monocrop agriculture in this valley that's very fertile. And in 300 years, because I'm sorry, I know I really try not to. There might be a couple. I think. Yeah, there's at least one in here. And I've seen a couple people do pop. So when we see this translation, what they're doing is when you rip out everything in a space, you rip out all the nutrients from the biome. You rip out all the things that replenish your crops. You rip out all the things that replenish your soil. When you create a sterile environment and try and put something in that sterile environment, there's nothing there for them to work with.
Last week,
Again, apologies for the TikTok. When you rip everything out of a sterile environment, when you bring something into that sterile environment, it doesn't have anything to interact with, right? It doesn't have anything for nutrients. It doesn't have anything for, the ability to actually thrive and grow, right? So we see that with Angus, what they did was they have this beautiful fertile valley. They rip everything out of the fertile valley and they plant it with crops, and then they husband their animals in the hillside. They herd their animals in the hillsides. And of course, the animals, you have a city. To provide enough nutrients for a city, you have to have a lot of animals and you have to have a lot of space for monocrop agriculture. And so in taking most of this, yeah, and that's it right there. And I have no problem addressing that. My issue sometimes becomes the fact that when I am focused on something else, the way that I address it stumbles. And since the way that I address it stumbles, it sounds like I'm not legitimate because I'm stumbling because my brain is here and you've just pulled my focus from here. I want to honor the question because who claims me is important, right? This is in an Indigenous community. We know these things, right? And I know these things. So I want to address that because I want to show respect. And at the same point, my brain's over fucking here. And so this addressing comes across wrong or like I'm not who I am. And that means that like it just becomes, and I'm like, oh, and I've been told over and over again, you just need to stop it by Indigenous elders and by Indigenous leaders who have told me over and over, you just need to stop fucking addressing it in your lives, right? So I just try and go this way. Yeah, and that's what it was. It was the she claims, and that threw me because it's like, no, boo, nobody said I claim, like, and I'm very like, I utilize the term globally mixed and Indigenous because of the fact that it's about doing better for me, right? It's about acknowledging for me, right? Like I stated earlier, I have grandmothers who were enrolled, but I'm not. So I would not stay Native because I am not a member of a nation that is Native. That's American Indian. It's a legal definition. It's, like I would not claim that. That does not mean that I, don't fully feel that I'm a part of community or anything else. I just would not claim that. So I know when you ask percentage that you don't know what you're talking about. And that's where the problems come in, is because it's a bunch of people who think that they're getting good on somebody who don't really know how we deal. And that right there is the problem, right? Because blood quantum is a colonial idea, as Aubrey just said, right? So, but anyways, back on to the point. When we're looking at the way that monocrop agriculture is practiced in Angazol, ripping everything out and then replacing it with that monocrop agriculture means that the soil fails, right? The soil loses all its nutrients after, a few hundred years, and they actually have to move. Now, Angazol has grown several times. Angazol is currently there along the river in Jordan, and you can see Angazol. But we know through archaeological digs along the river Jordan in Angazol that this is what has happened over the course of the years, right? Yes, absolutely. That's actually the topic we're on right now, Stargazer. Because for me, this all ties into the othering that we were kind of talking about a little bit ago when we were talking about race and race theory as well, because this is where it all starts. I am just waiting for the question, which don't feel like I'm like Anya, but I letting everybody else know why I'm not talking. And while I do that, I'm actually going to take some of my medicine so I'm a little bit less painful and having issues. They do have red clay in the area. From my memory, I haven't been to Jordan, though. I've been to Iraq and I've been to Kuwait, but I have not been to Jordan. So I'm not exactly positive if they have red clay around there. 1 second. Because biological sex, there's 3 biological sexes. And because gender is a social construct. And almost every society across the globe prior to colonization had at least 3 genders. I don't know of any that had less than 3 genders. I know several that had 5 genders. So there, I say, or I would state that our thought process of, it might be more of a religious construct, though I do think, okay, so I personally see the start of othering based on gender in the ancient Greeks. And so that wasn't so much a religious concept there, right? So I'm not exactly positive on that. Ryan, the last word in there is considered a slur these days. We don't actually see it used. Intersex is the word that you're looking for. And those are sexes, not genders. Gender is not based on biology. It's based on perception of self. It's based on the id, the conscious of self that we were talking about a little bit ago. And so gender, I've seen outside of modern thought process, even we performed a trans surgery, like a transitioning surgery in the, like 1898, right? So like we've been transitioning people for a long time, right? Like, so even within our society, having two genders is very relatively new, right? And it is actually more common in it's more common to have more genders than less. I do not know of a society prior to this that had less than 3. Take care, Oki. Yeah, well, there are many, though that term actually is, I believe, Ojibwe, though it has been cross-adopted by many of us, right? I'm a Two-Spirit myself. And they are very sacred in many Indigenous cultures, no matter what their what the verbal concept of them is. And it is really about the concept of being able to understand both sides of the coin, right? It's beautiful. Zaints, Quazain, I do not. The only part of your name that I know I'm not going to butcher is Two-Spirit. And I do not want to butcher your name, so apologize. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I know a couple that are from Ojibwe people who are Two-Spirit. And actually, like when I came on TikTok, somebody was like, "That's only for this nation," and I was like, "I've never heard that." And I went, and they're like, "No, I mean the concept is every nation, and we might have coined that term, but y'all had your own terms before they were taken away." Equasians. Equasions. Oh, you're fine. You're fine. No. Go ahead and answer your question, Star. Awesome. Equations. Awesome. Thank you. What is the record we see? The record for why we see the rise of violence? Is that what you were asking? Or how we record the rise of violence of 10,000 years ago? Perfect. So that is on the YouTube. You can see the tab on ancient science bibliographies, rise of violence, right? Just so you're aware, so you can find it in the future. What we see is that at 10,000 years ago, prior to 10, and I think she says 10 to 12,000 years ago in her article, one of them. So prior to 10 to 12,000 years ago, we have about 2,000 individuals that we can find in the fossil record. And of the 2,000 individuals, roughly 2% of them have things that can possibly be attributed to violence. And what I mean by possibly be attributed to violence is they might have, like, their skull looks like a rock hit it. And I can't tell you whether or not a hand was holding the rock when it hit it, or it fell from a ceiling in a cave and hit them, right? I can't tell you how they were hit with the rock. And since I can't tell you how they were hit with the rock, I can't tell you it was violence. I can say that there are several possibilities, and one of them includes violence, but they're not definitively violent, right? After roughly 10,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago, we see definitive violence in the archaeological record, and we see it rise in the archaeological record between 18 to 20% after 10 to 12,000 years ago. One of the first ones that we see is in Kenya, and it is 8 people lined up in a row, sitting on the ground with their hands bound. One of them is a pregnant woman, and her hands are bound underneath her belly, and they're all hit in the back of the head. So this is definitively violent. Thank you. Definitively violent. Why is it definitively violent? Because they were bound, right? And because they're all lined up, right? It kind of looks like a massacre or an execution. So we go from 2% of things that can possibly be violent to 18 to 20% of things that are definitively violent. And that's between 10 to 12,000 years ago. And it starts, so there's the one in Africa and Kenya. The majority of them, though, we start to see in the Middle East, up along the Nile, which is not the Middle East, like North Africa. That area, the area of the Nile, and going out into the Arabian Peninsula, up near to the Caucasus Mountains. That area along the Mediterranean. This has been populated, and along the Nile has been populated by humans since before we were humans, since Paranthropus boisei, our first tool maker, right? This is an area that has been populated since before we were human. It is the longest area really of occupation, right? And it's because of the fact that it's always been an extremely fertile area there, right? The swath of green that we see across the north part of, well, it's kind of like not quite the north part, but we separate North Africa and South Africa kind of dependent on the swath of green. That's actually moved over millennia, right? And so over the millions of years that we've been humans in Africa, this has kind of moved up and down, right? Yet still we see, like, even the Mediterranean, like this is where we have been. Our oldest Homo sapien is in Morocco. This is where we have always been forever, right? So it's really within where we, and this is why I correlate it with the rise of Western-based agriculture or monocrop agriculture, because where we see it starting is really in communities that are utilizing monocrop agriculture. And in the communities where we see this utilization of monocrop agriculture, and again, not exclusively, I don't believe we have evidence of Kenya having modern monocrop agriculture at this time, though I do believe that there is evidence that this was their village or their town or their place that they were at, these 8 people, like their home, and they were being invaded. Where we see that rise of possession of land, right? This is my land. And also where we see this rise of storing of food, of hoarding of food. And that hoarding of food kind of invites people to come and take your hoard, right? Or it invites people to hoard, right? And you see violence in the act of the hoarding itself, right? So when we see hierarchical-based cities, we see that those who are working in the dirt have a tendency to be less ranking than those who are up in the palace. And so if you're working in the dirt, it's more inclined that you're going to have violence inflicted against you. Even the act of forced labor or the act of labor for somebody else when your sustenance isn't really being met very well, or your needs aren't being met very well, that act in and of itself has a tendency to, or is in and of itself violence, right? Is in and of itself an act of violence. Keeping people without the necessities for life is in and of itself an act of violence. When we are looking at the rise of violence along this time, and when we're looking at the rise of Western-based agriculture, I talk about Sargon in this one a lot, because when you look at our first cities, so first, let's look at when we look at our first writing. Often our first writings are the retelling of oral traditions that have been told over periods of time, right? And now I found a new way to document this, and so now I'm going to document this. Think of the sagas that are written 200 and something years after the Viking Age about the Vikings, based on stories that have been passed down and then kind of twisted into the Christian ideology that Snorri had, right? Because Snorri was a monk, right? So, and most people who were writing at that time in that period were ecclesiastical, right? Or members of the church. So, when we see the first writings, we see the documentations of stories that have been handed down. The first writings that we see of our kings are the writings of Sargon, Sargon being the Great, right? We see Sargon the Great's documentation of his own childhood, or the story of Sargon's telling of his own childhood, and we see the story of Sargon telling how he rose to kingship. In the story, there is a concept that there's already a king there, yet you kind of wonder if it's a twist within the way it's said, because it's not like it's really there, right? It's just this kind of up there kind of thing. And there's no thought processes of any need to relate to him for rulership to be right? Sargon is written about in cuneiform. He is our first, like in our first stories. The writer of Sargon's tales is actually the first author that we have, the woman that's the first author. I don't have my books right now. They're all in my storage unit because I had somebody, we've rearranged the house. So I don't have quick aside, a lot of Indigenous cultures back then had rules against writing things down. Many Indigenous cultures actually had rules about writing down things like science and medicine, things that it was important that you understood. But you could write letters to each other. You could write down things like calendars, like you might have a calendar, a pictographic calendar, right? Which pictographs are also a method of writing. Think of the hieroglyphs, which are pictographs, right? So most Indigenous cultures, if they had a thought process of not writing down, it was literally don't write down the important things. And this is based on the fact that once you start writing it down, you stop losing memory, right? You start losing memory. And we've proven it today that Google is actually making it to where we remember things less because it's always at our fingertips. So once you start writing things down, you start losing the memory of them. So like the Druids didn't believe in writing down important things because they would teach them in 3-line stanzas and an iambic, which is the meter of the speech that was easy to learn. And they would repeat these 3-line phrases to you over and over again until you learned it. And then they would repeat a new one over and over, and you would go from this to this, this to this. And so by the time you're done with maybe 100 stanzas, you can remember all of them word for word because you've been taught to memorize them word for word without deviation. And this knowledge actually, this method of keeping knowledge is actually much more... it's maintained. This method of keeping knowledge is actually easier to maintain knowledge because in the constant repetitiveness of it and in the repeating it word for word and remembering it word for word, you're able to hold on to a vast amount of knowledge, and it's not like you have to reference things, right? And so that is why many Indigenous cultures don't actually utilize writing for important things. They will have forms of writing for, Snorri was here kind of shit, or hey, mom, what's up, kind of stuff. But just because it's important to understand that many cultures actually have writing, and many cultures actually had extensive writing. There's new evidence that there's writing in caves 27,000 years ago, like the markings of symbols. And there's thought process that some of the things in caves, like you'll see a bison on the side of a cave, and underneath the bison, there will be a bunch of lines or a bunch of dots. And so it's thought that these things are like either tracking of seasons or tracking of numbers, right? And so these are a lot of different methods of writing that we've had for a long time. We just kind of think of cuneiform as our first, which is really silly because Egypt had the hieroglyphs at the time that cuneiform was invented, right? So like, we want to think that we're the best. We're just kind of full of ourselves. It's that ego. So we've decided that cuneiform, because it comes from where Western-based thought comes from, is the origin of writing because we're so great. I have a character limit. And I think a character limit is, like part of, cuneiform is the first alphabet. So every form of writing has a method of, or every form of writing is called something different depending on the number of characters within it and what the characters do. So an alphabet is something that is like between, I think, like 30 something and like 20, and then or maybe it's 18, and then like runes are everything 18 and under, right? Alphabet and runes both have to, or alphabet specifically has to have the markings only mean a sound, right? Whereas hieroglyphs can be any number, an amount, like from like 30 on up, I think is what it is. And in that number or amount, the symbols will indicate either a sound or a full word based on other symbols around them. Think of like the cartouche around symbols that make this a name instead of making it 3 different words, right? So, oh, I didn't say white on any of it. I said there's evidence in caves 27,000 years ago. Nobody said white in any of it. You can take your ick. So, oh, beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and in cuneiform, it's our first alphabet. I was astonished actually when because I had always thought I looked at the date on cuneiform and I looked at the date on ancient Egypt and I was like, well, doesn't wait, what? And then when I was in school and we were talking about that, and it was brought up because well, what about? And they're like, actually, you're right that, this is way older. We just call cuneiform the start of writing because of the fact that it's our first alphabet, right? And so that has a lot to do with it. Sargon is one of our first stories that's written down. And the story of Sargon states Sargon was put in a basket as an infant and sent to float across or down the river and was pulled out of the basket. And the translations differ whether or not it was a gardener for a potential king that pulled him out or whether or not it was a subsistence-based farmer that pulled him out. And when he's pulled out of the river, he's adopted by this, and it's always a man. He's adopted by this man and he's raised by this man. And the man is raising him in a lack, right? We get more nutrients for less time out of hunting and gathering than we do out of farming. Western-based agriculture, monocrop agriculture, animal husbandry, anything that involves tilling a field and trying to keep other things out involves way more work. Hunter-gatherer societies today, communities today, your overworkers, your overachievers will work about 16 hours a week. Everybody else works an average of 8 hours a week. And this provides the entire community with everything they need, all the nutrients they need, the clothing that they need, the child care for your children, the tools that you need, all of those different things is based on the hard worker who really just loves to go out and hunt 16 hours a week, right? Awesome. That's amazing. So when we're looking at this, we absolutely see that this need to, or the farming is hard, right? And it's dirt floor poor, right? So what we would think of today as dirt floor poor. You're up at the crack of dawn or before dawn doing everything you can to try and bring in a crop. You're not going to have food to eat on a regular, on a yearly or year-round basis. And if we are dealing with a point where you're dealing with any form of ruler, so again, there's 2 translations, and one states it's a gardener for a king, right? I tend to go with a sustenance farmer because I place Sargon as being one of our earliest kings, right? Yet if he isn't, if he comes down later and, say the start of writing is 5,000 years old, the first city is 9,000 years old, if Sargon is not here, but more here, then there is probably kings involved. But when we look at Sargon, what we see is he decides that he's a child of a god, the river goddess specifically. And his hard-scrabble childhood, right? The things that he endures and the abandonment that he endures makes him somebody who gathers together a bunch of people and decides to start a city, decides that he needs to be the ruler over all of these people. To me, this is MPD. Every little inch of this is MPD to me because, first of all, MPD is usually created by a childhood trauma of abandonment and then abuse. There is thought process that there is a gene, an aggression gene that has to do with whether or not you have one of the dark triad mental health issues, right? But even with that gene, having that gene, you still have to be triggered. You still have to have an event that triggers the gene, turns it on to create it. And narcissistic personality disorder. So N is the first word. It sounds like that's what we use. My words today. My words. So when we're looking at his childhood and his start, and as he's moving along, we can absolutely see not only is there this childhood trauma and abandonment and the belief that he's the child of God, right? But we see that he then kind of gathers people to him and utilizes those people to perform this, or not perform, create this kind of protection racket, right? And in this creation of this protection racket, basically he says, you need me to defend you from the barbarians in the hills who are coming to steal your grain. And so because you need me and my big bad guys to protect you from the barbarians in the hills to come to steal your grain, we're all going to gather together and we're all going to start a city together. And I'm going to be your ruler and you're going to pay me and I'm going to pay them and they're going to protect you. And so with this, we see this rise of the, I don't think I used mob mentality. And I wasn't, you must mean last week because I wasn't on yesterday, but I don't think I used mob mentality. Oh, mob. Yes. Sorry. Mob mentality, when you said it that way, to me makes me think of like mob mentality as a huge herd of people who will go and attack somebody. Mob. I did explain it as the mob. You are correct. And so it's a protection rab. Yeah. It's that mob thought process. It's that I need you to pay. Sorry. I didn't mean to like discredit what you were saying. It's like our first writing. So I believe it's, and I can't say her name. It starts with an E and it's a whole bunch of letters. But the first, it's to my memory. And again, I don't have the book in front of me right now. It's down in the storage unit. To my memory, it's actually Iwa Eandre, which is the first female or the first writer that we have. And it was a woman. Thank you. Thank you. And Hyodwana. So, and my remembrance, and again, I don't have the book in front of me, so I could be wrong at who wrote this down, but my remembrance is that's who wrote this down because it is one of our first stories. So we see that he utilizes this barbarian in the hills thought process. Oh, from where? The book itself. I can't think of the name. I like know it. It's like so I've got a translations of the ancient Sumerian texts, and actually it's a translation of ancient texts all over that region. It has hieroglyphic translations in it as well, and I don't remember what the name of the translations is. I think it's Near East or Near East Stories of the Ancients or something like that. I'll have to go and look it up and put it up. But it is Sumerian. It is ancient Sumerian stuff. I think now I want to say, oh, I hate not having my books. Let me just Google real quick. So there's the 23rd century BCE in Mesopotamia. So that would be about 4,300 years ago, basically. No, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, so he's known almost legends and tales that followed his reputation through 2,000 years of cuneiform Mesopotamian history, and not from documents that were written during his lifetime. And he's from Agade, and he is supposed to have built Agade. And even like Encyclopedia Britannica just goes over pretty much everything I just said, where it says, according to the folktale, he was a self-made man of humble origins. A gardener, having found him as a baby floating in a basket on the river, brought him up as his own calling. His father is unknown. His own name during his childhood is unknown. His mother is said to have been a priestess in the town in the middle of Euphrates. Though in the translation that I read, the translation that stated that she was a river deity. And I mean, this is Britannica, so I mean, and that's like, no, but it is before the story of Moses. Like it's not, so it is after Egypt because Egypt is older, right? Kemet is, let me see. 33rd century BCE is Dynasty 00. So it's it is stated to be, or it is first written about, or in the writings stated to be 1,000 years after the founding of Egypt. And again, Egypt had writing, and they didn't get the right later on. When we see this use of othering, and this use of othering is really to maintain control. If I can get you to fear your neighbor, then you're going to pay me to take care of you. Hey guys. They could be somebody stated with the medicine that it could be deceased humans. And I'm sorry, I didn't see YouTube for a while. I apologize, YouTube, because I was over on that website looking at things. Somebody said it could be on deceased humans, and that's absolutely positive. That's absolutely plausible, or thought process of that. I would state though that you're probably, if you're performing surgeries on deceased humans, right, anatomy on deceased humans, it is absolutely, as you stated, speaks to medical tradition forming. Absolutely, I would state that you would need I would think that I would need a reason to start that. So I would think that probably what would happen in something like that is I try it and I fail. And so then I go and I'm, maybe I try it again on the dead guy. I'm not going to see like what I need to do to make them live though. Right. Like the things like knowing that you have to stem the flow of blood by cauterizing. That might be, have a great one, Aubrey. That might be, like, I might be able to see that somebody bleeds out and then practice how to take care of it on somebody who's dead. Yet I'm not sure. It's not going to give me what I need to know for certain that they're going to live through the next one. Right. So while I can see that there is a possibility of practicing on those who have been deceased, absolutely, and I wouldn't discredit that at all, I would state that with that, you're still going to need to practice on somebody. You're still going to need to perform the surgery a couple of times before you're perfect on a live being, right? Because there are certain things that you're only going to understand from a live body. The rate of the blood flow, that they're going to bleed out, that the skin is not going to retract and flow down over again on a dead body. Like if I cut through a dead body, I'm not going to be able to pull the flesh up and have it go down because it doesn't move as easily anymore, right? And so there are some things that I do think that you would have to have gone through an actual surgery on a live person a couple times for it to work. But it is a good point and it is absolutely speaking to medical tradition flowing either way, right? Or tradition forming either way. Yeah, I love history. I stopped doing history though and started I love history on a lot of levels. I also find that history doesn't honor a lot of people's, because history is legitimately written story. That's what the word history means, is written story, right? And so it only honors the stories of people if they've been written down. It doesn't honor the stories of other people. And that to me is really problematic. And then, we've all heard the phrase, history is written by the winners. And it is almost always written by people who are in charge, right? And so it's always written from a bias that is looking for confirmation bias. Because you're not going to look, like, we all have biases everywhere. But you're not going to, if you're trying to justify why you're killing people, you're not going to look for a reason not to. So you're going to be looking for confirmation bias, right? Yeah, and it usually focuses on war. And it almost always talks about the other people negatively, like, talking about medicine in Turtle Island and Abiyala as, being shamanistic or being, that ethereal, like you're just dancing and singing and hoopla, like that's all that it is, right? Instead of understanding, herb interaction and understanding, how the Sorry, it froze over there again, and it's freezing over there. Let me see if I can get back in. Sorry, it froze on me again. So it's almost always like looking for reasons to. It never really spreads like an unbiased truth, right? It never really looks at it, and just like we were talking earlier about. It's important to have Indigenous archaeologists and Black archaeologists and Indigenous scientists and Black scientists because if you're only looking at something through one lens, right? And if I'm only looking at something through my lens, then I am absolutely incapable of seeing the full truth, right? Mono thought is never done us any good. It is new stuff, meeting, like two boxes coming together that gives us an outside of the box, right? And history is often proven wrong by archaeology, right? Which is why I do now prefer archaeology. There's just I disagree with some archaeology, right? There's a lot that, like we were talking with the girl earlier with Skelly and the 31,000-year-old surgery. And I was stating, they think that she must have been an extremely important member of society for somebody to have tried to do this surgery. Whereas I think that because I can look at it through the Indigenous lens that I was raised in, through the Indigenous lens that was the first teachings that I have. I can look at it through a communal lens. I can see that you don't necessarily have to be a high value member of community for you to matter to community, because in Indigenous community, all the community matters, right? An orphan is not a high value member of community, but we still keep the orphan safe. And there's never an orphan because they're always taken care of by the community, right? So, and archaeology has, and like the theory of the way we evolved just got changed this last year, right? Like the thought process that we evolved through isolation, speciation through isolation. We just found out that a fantastical what everybody thought was a fantasy way to speciate is actually how we speciated, speciation through convergence. And up until last year, anybody you talk to would tell you, well, that's a fantasy, that's theoretical, that could never happen. Some people think it might possibly happen, right? And now we know that we speciated that way. So, and that's why, like at the beginning, and I always try and repeat, I may be right today, but I may be wrong tomorrow, right? I may think I'm right today because I have this information, and you can come to me and go, hey, Sarah, that got, proven wrong yesterday. Or, hey, Sarah, did you know there was an article from a year ago that states completely different? Oh, well, no, I didn't. Because again, I am not the be all end all of knowledge. I don't know everything. I don't want to know everything. There's too much knowledge in this world to shove in my little fucking brain. I'm going to do as much as I can to find out as much as I can. Cause I love knowledge, but it's still too much to shove it all in there. There was a perfect example when I did radiography. I did physics for radiography, and in the physics that I did for radiography, the book that we did with physics, the guy who wrote the book, he liked to do these little boxes that would have penguins. And in the penguins, the concept with the penguins was if you have bunches and bunches of penguins on an ice, not an iceberg, but like a chunk of ice floating in the water, or even an island of ice. If you put another penguin on, the more penguins you put on, sometimes there's just not enough room to put another penguin on, and a penguin falls off, right? The more knowledge you shove in your brain, you have to, kind of, some of it's got to go somewhere to make room for the next stuff, right? So for me, I think that it's really important to know that I don't know everything. I think we should all know that we don't know everything, right? I want to make sure where I was at. Othering. So we see that the first othering is the barbarians in the hills, and is really used by Sargon and by our first kings as a method of control, right? If I protect you, then you can pay me. And then you see that they take it and they hoard it, right? Hoarding is something that happens because of dearth. If you have lack in your childhood, in your, in your stages of development, if there is lack, right, you will start hoarding that. Even as an adult, if there's lack, you will start hoarding that afterwards, right? And we saw this in the Depression. People were starving. And so people who lived through Depression oftentimes would keep, I knew one woman who had like 4 deep freezes, the huge old chest freezers full of food that she and her family could never eat, but she hoarded food because she had starved, right? We see that people who go through lack, people who go through not having their necessities met will then hoard some of those necessities later on, right? And so we see with these early God kings that there is this hoarding of food, which to me ties back to the thought process that Sargon had dearth in childhood, right? Right. And a lot of that has to do with a lack. People who are very poor in childhood will become hoarders as adults because they can't throw anything away because they know someday they'll have a use. I struggle with this, right? Like when I left for Standing Rock, I actually got rid of everything I owned. And a part of it was I'd just gotten out of a 10-year marriage that was really bad. And it was good to get rid of all of it, but I literally got rid of everything I owned. And I had like a garage full of stuff in boxes that I hadn't even looked inside those boxes probably for a year. Some of them I probably hadn't looked inside the box for 10 years. Right. And it's because I grew up dirt floor poor. And I mean dirt floor. We had a dirt floor. I spent 3 years in a teepee, right, on the side of a mountain in Eastern Washington. So I grew up dirt floor poor, and I grew up where sometimes we didn't know what we were going to eat, right? And I grew up, it was not a lot, right? And so I know that I can use this later. like this tin right here. I'm sure I can use it later. I'm sure that somewhere along the road, I'm going to have to fix something with this, right? So actually, I think so. I think Columbus was known as a lech, and Columbus was known as a drunk. Columbus was known by the Spanish people. Columbus was kicked out of his own country. Columbus was what is the word for it? Exiled from his own country because of what a horrible human being he was, and so his country exiled him. Okay, and so I think that absolutely, I think that when we, are struggling throughout the course, since we have had kings, since we have had a hierarchy, those on the bottom are constantly trying to marry into those on the top. And the reason is because if you don't want your children to starve, it looks really nice up on that hill, right? Nobody starves on that hill. That's where they hoard the grain. My children won't starve if I marry you, right? So we see that people have been trying to marry up since the start of this hierarchical thought process where those on top get to keep from everybody else, get to hoard, right? And I think that this is why we see MPD at such a high rate and the dark triad traits at such a high rate in society today. Because I think that with our first God kings, it becomes a genetic mutation, and everybody trying to marry into ruling families so that they can have children that can live, right, means that the gene gets passed down throughout the entire society. And when we look at today, every single person on this planet that comes from a space that had any form of hierarchical rulership can trace themselves back to Charlemagne or Genghis Khan or Cleopatra, right? Every single person in a place that had hierarchical, we can trace the vast majority of anybody of you. There's literally like, they say that the descendants of Charlemagne are like 95% of the European population, right? I can trace my genetics back to Charlemagne, right? They say that a huge percentage of the Asian population is traceable back to Genghis Khan. When you look at the genetics of everybody, you can trace everybody back to kings. And this is very much because your genetics continue if you get to eat. If you have enough food, if you have warmth, if you have a house to live in, your genetics continue, right? Oh, fuck off on that one. No, we will not. I have put at least 3 of my genetics into this world, and mine are going to work better than their genetics because my genetics aren't dumbass stupid, right? Like, no. Um, but we see that you can really trace everybody, like in specific areas, you can trace them all back to one person. Like you can look at even within spaces that don't have a lot of hierarchical rulership, you can trace a lot of people back to a singular person just because of the way that genetics is biased, right? Like everything has bias in it, right? And genetics themselves have bias in them, right? Certain genes work better for an environment. Certain people get fed. Certain people have warmth, right? So I think that, and I think that they say that the dark triad is like 15% of our population currently. And I think it's because we spend so much time trying to marry into food, trying to marry the person that was hoarding the food from us so that we could actually make sure that our children survived. Personally, I mean, that's my hypothesis. I has not definitively proven that as a theory yet, right? Like that's my hypothesis on it, right? Well, and that's why most of society today actually kind of looks alike. Unless you're extremely mixed, you probably look like at least 10 other people. There's probably at least 10 doppelgangers out there, right? Yeah, he was totally lost. And he repaid them by stealing their children and taking them back to Spain as SA slaves. Right. Real winner, that motherfucker. So we see that the start of othering is based on the barbarians in the hills. And we see that othering is the way to keep beautiful people. I have a lot of, well, not a lot, but I have quite a few friends who are Taino. And actually, I am really excited about the fact that I actually get to go to Puerto Rico next year with my sister from another mister and my partner and her partner and a couple other kids. And that for me is going to be a really, like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm going for the sun and the sea too, right? Like I can't wait to be in a hot sand beach because I've never been in a hot sand beach. A lot of it for me though is that thought process of the first, like I've done a lot of study on what happened in that first, invasion, in that first genocide, right? Or that first attempt of genocide, right? There's a lot of study that I've done in there. And for me, it'll be powerful just because of that. So that othering based on barbarians in the hills changes into nation states as we go further on. And after it changes into nation states, it goes like that other nation state is going to steal from us. So you need to pay me so I can pay the soldiers so they can protect us. It changes into gender roughly about the Greeks. We see that the Greeks prefer teenage boys to women, preteen boys to women. And so they start to other based on gender. And, you got to maintain control over your society. And if you can find somebody for them to hate within society, all the easier for you to maintain control on your society. If you can make me hate my next door neighbor, right? And when we see, no, I am not saying that people who are marginalized through generations down became people with dark triad traits. I'm saying that the dark triad traits comes from the top, comes from the kings, comes from the top of the hierarchy, and that in trying to maintain life, that people that's how it's become a cross population thing, right? You're fine. I just want to make sure that that's not how it's coming across. I'm saying that it is as prevalent in our population today because everybody was trying to marry up, right? Yet it's not that you see it more prevalent in marginalized people today. It is actually less prevalent in marginalized people than it is in non-marginalized people today. If you look at the studies that they've done on dark triad traits, they're less prevalent in marginalized groups than they are in non-marginalized groups. So I'm not saying that that's I'm not saying on any level that marginalized people have more dark triad traits. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what I'm saying is it's the only reason that we all have that, or that there's a prevalence in society at the rate that it is as a global scale, because the global rate is like, I think it's like 15 to 20%. I can't remember off the top of my head what the percentage is, but it's like 15, it's in there, right? Like roughly in that area. And the reason that it is like that on a global scale instead of 1% of the population is because of the fact that trying to marry to save your life, trying to marry to make sure your kids eat, trying to marry. And then, you married a narcissist and now he's passed the gene on to your child and abused your child. Right. So yeah, there's a few different ones that say a few different things. And I'm not exactly sure. Like I read that study because I was dealing with one. So it's been a second since I've read the study. So it might even be updated, right? It's been a couple of years. So when we are looking at the way othering works, we see that othering is definitely something that is being used by those in charge to try and keep those below them in check. We see that it goes from barbarians to the nation states to gender within the ancient Greeks. After it becomes gender within the ancient Greeks, who also had 3 genders, right? Because they have male, they have female, and they have, it's not a gender, but like they didn't consider young boys to be male or female because you weren't allowed to like they same sex wasn't like encouraged, right? Like you wouldn't have sex with a man your age, but so and then after gender, we see it translate into religion. We see this translation into religion when we start to see Christianity taking off, when we start to see monotheism really going. And then after YouTube, I'm going to have to step outside with the puppy. So I'll be right back for YouTube. After we see it become about religion, we start to see it become about the phenotype of a person. We start to see it come about as a phenotype. This comes about as a side effect of the religion. We start to see at that point of time that Christianity is overall rating themselves as lighter skin, and Islam is at that point overall slightly on the darker skin scale, right? And so because of this, in their othering based on religion, they other based on Islam, and they're looking at Islam as being evil. And they're utilizing, because Islam continues to practice medicine, Islam continues to practice science. And so they're seeing this equation of, these questionings of God, playing God as being evil. And then they start equating it with phenotype. When they get to Turtle Island and Abba Yala, we see this double down of the phenotype equation. And this is where we start to see the theory of race coming in. The theory of race prior to the theory of evolution, though, is a theory based on the Bible, and it's based on who was marked as being bad by God for it's one of Noah's sons, and I believe it's Ham, but somebody said Shem the other day, and I can't remember. So one of Noah's sons saw him naked, and because he saw him naked, God marked him, and the mark of Ham is considered to be having darker skin. And so they start making it about dark skin based on the Bible, and make it into this early thought process that different races exist based on the sons of Noah. Now, at this point, we see that they're also starting to appropriate science. They're also starting to appropriate medicine. They're getting these knowledges. And so we start to see the theory of evolution start to be created. And when the theory of evolution starts to be created, we start to see this concept of, well, shit, I can't blame it on the Bible and God anymore. So now I have to find another reason to justify the fact that I've been committing atrocities against human beings. And so we see this shift over into, well, it's about evolution. Certain people are more evolved than other people. And so the theory of race literally states, and this is where out of Africa theory has been debunked. The thought process that we're all from Africa has not been debunked. What has been debunked is that we all left Africa, except for those who are still in Africa, at 150,000 years ago. And because we've been separated from those, completely separated, isolated from those within Africa for 150,000 years. Those outside of Africa evolved further than those inside of Africa, with, of course, the exception of this group here and that group there and that group there, because really only Europeans are the heavily evolved ones, right? So we start to see this concept that your phenotype, your skin tone, the style of your, or the texture of your hair, the color of your eyes, the thickness of your lips, the shape of your jaw, that all of these things denote where you are at on the evolutionary scale within the human species. Thank you. So you got to be sarcastic with some of this stuff, right? So when we see that, what we see is this concept that they can mark where you are at on the evolutionary scale. It's not that they're separate species, because they can't conceive of us as being separate species, because we can breed so easily. We can have babies so easily, right? So they can't, or together, right? Across different races. They have to therefore make it to where it's not quite speciation for it to work within the pseudoscience at the time, right? And so what they end up doing is they end up stating that it's race, and that a different race denotes where you're at on the evolutionary scale within Homo sapiens. And in this concept, we start to, this concept is what we call eugenics. And eugenics has been across the globe. Eugenics put Sami children in residential schools, just like it put Turtle Island children in both US and Canada in residential schools. The theory of eugenics was co-created by Europeans and Americans who are also Europeans, right? And in its creation, you see that Hitler came to the United States. I should not have said that name. The bad guy with the mustache came to the United States to get his theories, to get his concepts. Reservations are 100% concentration camps. They always have been, right? And we also see that South Africa came here to get the concepts for apartheid as well. America does their racism the best. Across the globe, everybody's decided that's why they come here, right? So we see that here, it was the Loving versus State of Virginia in 1967 that ended the federal ban on interracial marriage, and that's 1967. They claim to have stopped forced sterilizing Turtle Island Indigenous women, Native American women, within the United States in 1978, which is the year I was born, yet I know women my age who were forced sterilized. And we all know what happened at the border a couple of years ago, where people were given forced hysterectomies, which is absolutely forced sterilization. So, yes, and we also see, and this is actually, we're going to touch on this one really quick in just a second. So let me go on to it, and I'll put that in a second. We do also see experimentation done extensively and still, right? And we were talking earlier about medical racism. Little dog, I am not feeding you. and you just went outside. You've had lunch and it is not dinner time. You can come here. Come here. Got a toy? Okay. So the theory of race, being based on these pseudosciences, when we start to see the ability to test DNA, we see the Whole Genome Project. And the Whole Genome Project is a global project. And what it does is it takes DNA from everybody, or everybody who will willingly give it, and it uses that to map genetics. And within the Whole Genome Project, as I was stating earlier, we see that there's more genetic, I'm burping all over the place. There's more genetic difference between or within primary populations than between primary populations, right? So when we're looking at genetic differences between primary populations, we see that you're more likely to share genetic similarities with somebody clear across the globe than you are with your next door neighbor. Again, like I was saying earlier, this makes sense because inbreeding is bad. We've known inbreeding is bad for years, It killed off the Ptolemies. It did damage to the Habsburgs. We've known inbreeding is bad for years and years and years. So it makes sense that you want to have more genetic difference in the population than between populations, right? Because you want to have enough genetic difference between your next door neighbor and you so that when your children get married, they're not creating mutant children, right? And we also see with the Whole Genome Project that all of the genetics known within the human genome are seen within the Kwa people of South Africa. And this means that you can see blue eyes, you can see light skin, the alleles for light skin are there, the alleles for dark skin are there, right? You can see every gene. We also know now, and this is the medical racism, we also know now that a lot of things that we say, Black people in America have heart problems. Black people in America don't have heart problems. Black people in America are redlined into spaces that are filled with chemicals that create heart problems. So Black people in America, because of redlining, are more inclined to have heart problems, not because of genetics, but because of redlining, because of space, because of where they have been put. We see that Native American people in the United States are prone to diabetes. Native Americans are not prone to diabetes genetically. Native Americans in the United States and in Canada have been the subject of nutritional experiments for several hundred years at this point, where they were starved or where they were fed things that had no calories to them, so that they were not getting nutrients. And currently commodities, if you've ever ate them, I mean, I love my commods, but there's a reason we call it commod bod, because it is absolutely heavily processed food, right? And so heavily processed food will create diabetes, right? And so we know that heavily processed food will not only create diabetes, but many other problems. And we see many of those problems associated with Turtle Island Indigenous people because of the fact that they have been forced into a space that they're not allowed to leave. They're not allowed to get food outside. These are typically food deserts. And for a very extended period of time, their nutrition has been an experiment, right? So this is why we see that people within Turtle Island who are Native American are more prone to diabetes, not because they're Native American, but because of what has been done to them, right? Because of the nutritional experiments. We also absolutely see within medicine that racism means that the father of gynecology, that nasty ass, actually performed hysterectomies on Black slaves without anesthesia, right? Or HeLa genes, like anything that's HL, like we were talking earlier about an HL gene, anything that's HLA, HeLac, this comes from Henrietta Lacks. And Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman who's, they couldn't figure out how to keep DNA alive outside the body or cells alive outside the body. And she has eternal cells, or she had eternal cells. And you might have seen in the news where her family had to sue the state, right? I think it was like the medical board or something like that, to get her genes back, because they have done every experiment known to man on those genes after they stole them from her. Nobody knew that they were taking them. Nobody knew that they were keeping them, right? So we see that medical racism is still very prevalent. Again, racism is another way to other. If I can get you to hate your neighbor, you're not trying to overthrow me. If I can get you to hate your neighbor, you're paying $5 at the pump, and you know that you shouldn't be paying $5 at the pump, but it's your neighbor's fault, not mine, right? If I can get you to hate your neighbor, then you'll give me every last dime you have to protect you from that mean-ass neighbor. Meanwhile, your neighbor's paying them every dime they can to protect them from you, right? And so we see 100% that this theory of othering is about keeping people in check. If I can keep you in check, if I can keep you dumb, if I can keep you without a friend, if I can keep you alone, if I can disillusion you, if I can make you believe that this is who you are, if I can do all of these things, then you'll never overthrow me. You'll never know that there's something better out there, that we were something better, right? And today we see that this theory of othering, this utilization of othering to keep people in check, really has moved on. It still maintains all of the other ones. We're still othering based on nationality. We're still othering based on gender. We're still othering based on barbarians in the hills. We still have the Appalachians, like we're still othering based on all of these things. We've now included immigration and houselessness to the problem, to the othering cycle, right? If I can get you to believe that it is the person sleeping on the tent that is the problem and not the government that provides nothing for the person sleeping in the tent, or that sleeping in a tent is a bad fucking thing. I tell you, there are days I miss the nothing but fabric between me and the rest of the world, right? There is a nostalgic longing in me for that frequently, right? So even the fact that the tent is a bad thing, right? So all of this othering really just keeps us all in check. It just keeps us all down. It just keeps us from overthrowing, right? I have been going for like 3 hours, and I'm going to go ahead and go. Before I go, I'm going to end my live with what I always end my live with. We didn't really go over a whole lot today about this subject, but biologically, we are nurturing and communal, and I'm just going to give a quick breakdown on that. Biologically, we know we are communal because we have something called mandatory midwifery. We must have assistance in birthing our children. Don't leave yet, please. And that assistance comes because of the shape of the head, the shape of the shoulders, the shape of the pelvic outlet, and we literally have to turn our children twice to pull them out. We have to have somebody do that. This means we must have community to give birth. We have 5 brain development stages from newborn to fully developed brain at 25 currently. Those are called life stages. We have 5 life stages. The only other person on the planet who has ever had mandatory midwifery is Neanderthals. Denny is half Neanderthal. And the only other on the planet who has had near as many life stages as us is also Neanderthals, but they only had 4 life stages. We have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. And those stages of brain development are important in everything we are. And those stages of brain development require nurturing. And they require nurturing from more than one person. They require nurturing from a multitude of people, as studies are continuously showing. And they require nurturing, as studies are continuously showing, or we die. They did failure to thrive studies in the 50s. I'd encourage you to look them up, but read them with caution, right? Because of this, we know that biologically we are nurturing and communal. Many of us think that biologically we're evil. Many of us think that we're biologically locusts. Many of us think that we're fighting the evil within to be better. If you think that you're innately evil, you can't fix innateness. You can't change who you are innately because it's who you are. It's innate, right? We are not innately evil. We are innately nurturing and communal. And today we live in a society that teaches you to be nurturing and communal is bad. They gaslight you into this concept that love is bad. Don't take care of your neighbor. Don't take care of each other. Well, we're the church, and we think that everybody should take care of each other, so you need to pay me money so that I can maintain this church, but you certainly shouldn't be feeding the homeless, right? Put spikes out, right? We are currently in a society that teaches you to be nurturing and communal, teaches you that you only need 2 parents to raise a child instead of a community of 30 people to raise a single person from neonate to adult, right? Because we are taught that nurturing and communal is bad in today's society, many of us are dealing with mental health issues like depression and anxiety. Many of us know that there's a problem, but we can't figure out what the problem is, and so we internalize the problem as ourselves. Because we must have nurture and love to be able to grow and thrive, these are innate rights. If you have a right to live, you have a right to the basic necessities for life. And if one of the basic necessities for life is to be nurtured, then you have a right to be nurtured. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be exploitable to somebody who's sitting in a tower. All you have to do is breathe. To be worthy of the simple rights of life, the basic necessities for the right of life. All you have to do is breathe. So we live in a society where you're probably not getting nurture and you're probably not getting care. And people have probably told you that you have to do this and jump through that and be exploitable to be worthy of basic necessities. And that is a lie. You are having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Your depression, your anxiety, your awareness that there's a problem, your feeling that something's wrong, these are healthy responses to an unhealthy society. And being aware means you can help change it. Being aware means that you are one of the few people who can help change it, because we cannot change things. I got booted again. You're supposed to be. You just can tell I got booted when I just stopped talking mid-sentence. Just stop talking mid-sentence because I see the whole thing boots me out, right? Often we are living without love, compassion, nurture, and community. Your awareness means you can help change it. And it is only those of us who are aware that can help change it. Remember that othering, that shit, that's to keep you in check, right? Give yourself love and grace today because you deserve love and grace. And many of us feel like nobody in this world loves you. And I want you to know that I have felt that way most of my life. And it took people pointing out all the people that were around me that loved me at the time for me to realize that there have always been people who loved me. And I can almost certainly guarantee you that there are people around you who love you. You just don't see it. It's okay. Sometimes we're blind to that. It's hard to see sometimes because we're hurting, because this is an unhealthy society. And that's a very healthy response, right? And sometimes people's love doesn't come across right because everybody's been taught that love is hate and hate is love. That's that MPD God that's, teaching you that, God punishes Pharaoh for doing what God told Pharaoh to do. God punishes Pharaoh for doing what God told Pharaoh to do because God hardened Pharaoh's heart against the Israelites. So that MPD thinking, right? I'm going to punish you for doing what I told you to do. And so many of us are raised in the concept that that's actually loving behavior. And because so many of us are raised in the concept that that's loving behavior, we can love people and treat them like absolute shit. That's a problem with a lot of our parents out there, right? So I just want you to know that there are people that love you even if you don't see them, that I love you just because you're alive and you're breathing and you're aware and you're trying. I love you just because you're alive and you're breathing, you're aware and you're trying. And we need all of us to fix this shit. We need everybody who's aware to make everybody aware. The more people who are aware, the easier it is for change to happen. If we can change everybody's concept, then we can change the world. If we can change your concept, we can change the world. How do we fix this? Land back on a global scale. Returning tending and governance to Indigenous people on a global scale returns us to an animistic society on a global scale. And an animistic society is a society based on community, a society based on nurture, and a society based on the concept of tending as our space in this society, which means that not only do we end the climate destruction that is being caused by Western-based monocrop agriculture, but we also end the screaming out that we are all feeling in this horror. Land back on a global scale changes it all. Now, that doesn't mean anybody has to go back where they came from. The only people that think you should go back anywhere are colonizers. It means that the tending and governance is taken over by Indigenous people, right? So land back on a global scale changes this. Remember today that you are worthy just by breathing. Don't need anything else, just by breathing. Remember today that you are loved just by breathing, just by existing. You are loved and you are worthy of love. And take care of yourself. I love you all, and I will be back in a couple days, and we'll talk some more then, and we'll see what else we can come up with. Take care. And as you're taking care of yourself, remember to take care of others, right? But definitely give yourself the grace and nurturing that you need today, especially if you're not getting it anywhere else. Have a great one, everybody. Much love. Goodbye. Thank you so much to you who stayed over there on TikTok. You know, sometimes I wonder, or on YouTube, sometimes I wonder if the person sitting there is somebody that I know. And I want you to know that if you are sitting there and you are somebody that I know, especially if you're somebody who's a member of my family sitting there quietly and silently, that you too are loved and you too are necessary and you too are part of the solution. Please remember that I love you. Bye, everybody. Take care.